The nightmare always began the same way. Gunfire cracking across the ridge, screams mixing with the smoke that billowed from burning wagons, and those eyes, dark, terrified eyes of a child clinging to his shirt as bullets tore through the air around them. Everett Thorne jolted awake in the dark, sweat-soaked sheets twisted around him despite the chill desert night. For a moment, he lay still, waiting for his heart to slow its hammering. Dawn was just beginning to seep through the slats of the shutters, painting thin lines of pale light across the rough wooden floor of his cabin. Another day. Another chance to forget. Habit drove him from the narrow bed before the sun had fully risen. His movements were practiced, mechanical. Boots, shirt, the worn leather holster that hung by the door, heavy with the Colt revolver. He never went without, even here miles from the nearest neighbor. Outside, the air held the crisp bite of early morning, the sky a vast dome that would soon turn from gray to searing blue. Everett paused on the porch, scanning the horizon as he did every morning. Nothing but scrub rocky outcroppings and the distant outline of mountains. No movement but a hawk circling far above. The ranch was small by any measure, a cabin, a barn, a small corral for his horse, and a few chickens that scratched in the dust. But it was his, bought with years of wearing a badge of standing between ordinary folks and the kind of men he'd rather forget. Now all he wanted was to be left alone with his silence and the small peace he'd carved out here in the Arizona Territory, 1885. His boots crunched on the hard-packed earth as he crossed to the well, the heart of his small homestead. Without it, this patch of land would be as worthless as the rest of the surrounding desert. With it, he could sustain himself, his horse, his few crops. The well had been here when he'd bought the place 8 years ago after turning in his marshal's badge for good. The previous owner had died without heirs, leaving behind only this stone-lined hole into the earth that somehow, against all reason, held sweet, cool water. Everett grasped the rope and began to lower the bucket, listening to it scrape against the stone sides. The ritual was as much a part of his day as breathing. Lower the bucket. Listen for the splash. Pull it up hand over hand, feeling the weight of the water. Pour some into the basin to wash. Carry the rest to the house. But today, as the bucket hit the water below, he paused. Leaning over, he stared down into the dark circle, where the first rays of sunlight were just beginning to illuminate his own reflection. A weathered face looked back at him, once handsome, now lined with sun and years and memories. Gray threaded his dark hair at the temples. His beard was neatly trimmed, one habit from his lawman days he hadn't been able to break. In the rippling surface, he searched for something, though he couldn't have said what. Recognition, perhaps. Confirmation that he was still the same man who had once sworn to uphold the law, who had once had a wife and child, who had once believed in things like justice and home. The face that stared back offered no answers. He hauled up the bucket and went about his morning chores. Feed the chickens, check the horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Buck, who'd carried him faithfully for years. Inspect the fence line. Small, necessary tasks that filled the hours and kept his hands busy, if not his mind. By mid-morning, the sun had climbed high enough to beat down mercilessly. Everett worked in the garden patch beside the house, coaxing stubborn vegetables from the grudging soil. Years of living in the desert had taught him how to make things grow where they had no business surviving. A little like himself, he sometimes thought. The distant sound of hoofbeats froze him in place. He straightened slowly, one hand automatically moving to the revolver at his hip. Visitors were rare out here. The nearest town, Meridian Crossing, was half a day's ride, and he went there only when supplies ran low. The few neighbors scattered across the territory kept to themselves, just as he did. Strangers meant questions. Questions meant the past. And the past was something Everett Thorne had buried as deep as he could. He shaded his eyes against the glare, watching as a single rider emerged from the heat haze that shimmered across the flats. The horse moved with an uneven gait, clearly exhausted. Its rider sat straight in the saddle despite what must have been days of hard travel. As they drew closer, Everett's grip on his revolver tightened. The rider was a woman. An Indian woman by the look of her dark braids hanging down over a travel-worn dress patched in several places. Around her neck hung what looked like a medicine pouch, the kind he'd seen Apache women carry for protection. She guided her thin roan horse directly to the well, stopping a respectful distance away. For a long moment, she simply sat there, studying him with eyes that revealed nothing. Then she swung down from the saddle with a grace that belied her obvious exhaustion. "Water?" she said, her voice surprisingly clear and steady. "For my horse." Everett hesitated, then nodded once. "Help yourself." He watched as she drew a bucket of water for the horse, noting the efficient movements of her hands, the way she checked the animal's legs and flanks with practiced care. This was a woman accustomed to long journeys and self-reliance. When the horse had drunk its fill, she turned to face him directly. Despite the dust that clung to her face and the cracked dryness of her lips, her posture remained proud, almost regal. "Mr. Thorne," she said, meeting his gaze without hesitation, "I have come to marry you. I am the Apache child you saved 20 years ago." The words hit him like a physical blow. Everett felt his chest tighten, memories he had locked away for decades suddenly pushing against the walls he'd built around them. The gunfire on the ridge, the burning wagons, the small, terrified girl with blood on her face clutching at his shirt. As he dragged her behind a fallen wagon, he remembered the weight of her as he'd carried her across the arroyo with a bullet burning in his shoulder. Remembered shoving her into the arms of an old Apache woman and shouting for them to run north away from the slaughter. Could this be that same child? After 20 years, "What's your name?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. "I am called Ayana now," she replied. Not the name he remembered from that day, but he knew Apache children were often given new names as they grew, especially after significant events. And what had happened at Cedar Creek Crossing had certainly been significant. "How do you know who I am?" he pressed, still not convinced. "That was a long time ago." "I have never forgotten the face of the man who did not turn away when everyone else did," she answered simply. "I have carried it with me. When I heard stories of the former marshal who lived alone by a well, I knew it must be you." Everett studied her face, searching for some sign of deception. Finding none, he still couldn't bring himself to accept her outlandish declaration. "Why would you come here, after all this time, and with talk of marriage?" He shook his head. "If you need water and rest, you're welcome to it. But then you should move on." Ayana didn't flinch at his dismissal. "I have nowhere else to go," she said with the same directness. "My people have scattered. Many died of the fever. Others—" She paused, something flickering across her face, before it was masked again. "Others have turned their backs on me. I would not survive another season alone." "And so you decided to find a stranger from your childhood and declare yourself his wife?" Everett couldn't keep the disbelief from his tone. "You are not a stranger to me," she countered. "You carried me when no one else would. I remembered. That is why I came." Everett ran a hand through his hair, overwhelmed by the sudden intrusion into his carefully ordered existence. Everything in him wanted to send her away, to return to the silence and solitude that had been his only companions for years. Yet something, perhaps the memory of that day, perhaps the quiet dignity with which she stood before him, held him back. "You can stay in the barn for now," he said finally. "There's a small lean-to at the back. It's clean enough." If she was disappointed by this less than welcoming response, she didn't show it. She simply nodded. "Thank you." Agreeing to anything else, Everett felt compelled to add, "I understand." Ayanna replied, though something in her tone suggested she had already made up her mind about how this would end. She led her horse toward the barn, and Everett watched her go, unable to shake the feeling that his carefully constructed life had just been irrevocably altered. That night, he sat at his small table, nursing a cup of the strong coffee he favored, and listened to the unfamiliar sounds of another human being moving about his property. From the barn came the soft murmur of Ayanna's voice as she settled her horse. Then silence. Everett pulled out the worn journal he kept in a drawer beneath his bunk. Flipping past pages filled with weather observations, cattle counts, and the occasional terse note about supplies, he found the entry he sought. It was dated 18 years earlier, written in a hand that shook slightly. "Dreams again. Cedar Creek. The girl. Elizabeth. All of it mixing together until I can't tell what's memory and what's fear." He closed the book without writing anything new. What would he say? That a ghost from his past had ridden up to his door, that he'd let her stay against every instinct for self-preservation he'd developed over the years of solitude. Instead, he checked his revolver, as he did every night, and placed it within easy reach of his bed. Then he blew out the lamp and lay down in the darkness, knowing sleep would be long in coming. The morning brought no clarity. Everett rose at his usual hour, stepping outside, to find Ayanna already at work. She had drawn water from the well and was feeding the chickens, scattering grain, with the steady hand of someone who had done farm work before. He watched her for a moment, noting the way she moved, efficient, purposeful, but with an underlying grace that spoke of her Apache heritage. She wore the same travel-stained dress, but had somehow managed to make herself presentable. Her long black hair neatly braided and her face clean. When she saw him, she straightened, wiping her hands on her skirt. "Good morning," she said. Everett nodded in acknowledgement. "You've been busy." "Work needs doing," she replied simply. "I will earn my keep." He found himself unsure how to respond. It had been so long since he'd had a real conversation with anyone beyond the brief necessary exchanges in town. "Are you hungry?" he asked finally. "Yes." He cooked breakfast as he always did, bacon-fried crisp eggs from the chicken's biscuits made from the last of the flour. It was strange to set a place for someone else at the small table, stranger still to sit across from her in silence as they ate. Ayanna ate with the careful restraint of someone who had known hunger. She wasted nothing, not even the grease that she sopped up with the last of her biscuit. When finished, she carried her plate to the wash basin without being asked. "The fence on the north side needs mending," Everett said abruptly. "I was going to do it today." "I will help," she replied, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. They worked together through the morning, repairing the fence that kept coyotes away from the chickens. Everett was surprised by her knowledge. She knew how to test posts for stability, how to stretch wire without letting it snap back. Her hands, he noticed, were calloused and strong, accustomed to labor. As the sun climbed higher, he found himself stealing glances at her. There was something familiar in the set of her jaw, the determined focus in her eyes. Could she really be the same frightened child he'd pulled from the chaos 2 decades ago? "How did you survive?" he asked suddenly. After I left you with that woman." Ayanna paused in her work, a post digger held firmly in her hands. "We made it north," she said after a moment, "to her people. I stayed with them for a time." "But not forever," Everett prompted when she fell silent. "No." She returned to digging, putting her weight behind the tool. "Not forever." He sensed there was more to the story, but he didn't press. They all had parts of their past they preferred not to speak of. God knew he had enough of his own. By midday, the heat had become punishing. Everett called a halt to the work, and they retreated to the shade of the porch. He offered her water, which she accepted gratefully. "Rest," he told her. "We'll finish when it cools some." To his surprise, she didn't argue, simply settling on the porch step with a slight wince that she tried to hide. He pretended not to notice, going inside to escape both the heat and the unsettling presence of this woman who claimed to know him. Later, as the worst of the heat began to subside, they returned to the fence line. Everett held a post steady while Ayanna packed stones around its base. He noticed then that her dress had shifted, revealing a patch of skin on her upper back where the fabric had torn. What he saw made his breath catch. A network of scars crisscrossed her skin, not random marks, but deliberate patterns that spoke of systematic cruelty. The kind of scars left by a whip or a switch wielded with purpose. Ayanna must have sensed his gaze. She straightened, pulling the fabric back into place with a quick, practiced motion. Her face revealed nothing, but there was a new tension in her shoulders. "Who did that to you?" Everett asked quietly. "It does not matter now," she replied, her voice flat. "It matters to me if you're staying here." She looked at him, then a flicker of surprise crossing her features. "Why would it matter to you, Mr. Thorne?" The question caught him off guard. Why did it matter? He'd spent years building walls around himself, determined not to get involved in other people's troubles. Yet here he was, feeling a surge of anger at whoever had marked this woman's skin. "Because," he said slowly, "no one deserves to be treated that way." Ayanna studied him for a long moment, as if weighing his sincerity. Then she nodded once and returned to her work. But something had shifted between them, a small crack in the wall of silence that separated them. That evening, after a simple supper of beans and cornbread, Everett sat on the porch watching as darkness settled over the land. The first stars were just beginning to appear pinpricks of light in the deepening blue of the sky. He heard Ayanna's soft footsteps before he saw her emerging from the barn, where she'd gone to check on her horse. She paused at the edge of the porch, clearly uncertain whether she was welcome. "Sit if you want," he offered gruffly. She settled beside him on the step, a respectful distance away. For a while they sat in silence, listening to the night sounds of the desert. The cry of a distant coyote. The rustle of something small moving through the scrub. "Why did they cast you out?" Everett asked finally. "Your people." Ayanna's hands stilled in her lap. "They said I carried the blood of the betrayer," she answered, her voice low but steady. "The child who survives when others die becomes an ill omen. Some believed I should have been sacrificed to Mother Earth to restore balance." Everett felt a chill despite the lingering warmth of the day. "Because you survived the raid, that and other things." She looked out into the darkness. "After the fever took many in our camp, the shaman said I had brought the sickness, that I was tainted." "That's superstition, not reason," Everett said, unable to keep the edge from his voice. "To them it is the same." There was no self-pity in her tone, only a resigned acceptance. "When you live close to death, you look for reasons, for someone to blame." The words struck closer to home than she could have known. Hadn't he done the same after losing Elizabeth and the baby? Looking for reasons for someone to blame, when sometimes there were none to be found. "Why marriage?" he asked, changing the subject. "Why not just ask for shelter for work?" "A woman alone has no standing," she replied practically. "I have seen what happens to those with no protection, no place. I would not become that." "And you think I would protect you?" The question came out harsher than he intended. Ayana turned to look at him directly, her dark eyes reflecting the first stars. "You already did once," she said simply, "when no one else would." Later that night, long after Ayana had returned to the barn, Everett lay awake in his bunk, turning her words over in his mind. The memory of Cedar Creek was more vivid now than it had been in years. The chaos, the gunfire, the desperate flight across the arroyo with the child in his arms. He had never considered himself a hero. He'd simply done what needed doing, the same as he had throughout his years wearing a badge. Protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Stand between the innocent and harm. Basic principles that had guided him until that final day in Sabina's, when everything had gone wrong. After that, he'd hung up the badge for good, bought this place with his savings, and retreated from the world. No more standing between anyone and anything. No more responsibility for lives other than his own. And now this woman, this Ayana, had appeared on his doorstep, claiming a connection he'd thought long severed, asking for the one thing he'd sworn never to give, again his protection. Sleep eluded him until the first pale light of dawn began to seep through the shutters. The days that followed settled into an uneasy pattern. Ayana proved herself useful beyond question, mending clothes, tending the garden with a knowledge of desert plants that surpassed his own, helping with repairs around the homestead. She kept to herself when not working, spending time with her horse, or sitting in the shade, weaving something from reeds she'd gathered near the seasonal creek bed. Everett found himself watching her when she wasn't looking, the way she moved with quiet purpose, the rare moments when her guard dropped and he caught a glimpse of something like peace in her expression as she worked with her hands. The shadows that sometimes crossed her face when she thought herself unobserved. One evening, unable to sleep, he stepped outside to check on the horse and noticed a faint glow from the direction of the well. Moving silently, as he'd been trained to do in his martial days, he approached. Ayana knelt beside the well, a small fire of herbs burning in a clay dish before her. The smoke rose straight in the still air, carrying a scent that was sharp and unfamiliar. Her lips moved in words he couldn't understand, Apache words, prayers, or invocations to spirits he didn't know. As he watched, she removed something from around her neck, a small leather pouch, and held it over the smoke. Then, to his surprise, she leaned forward and dropped it into the well. Everett must have made some sound, for she turned sharply, her body tensing. "I meant no disrespect," she said quickly, rising to her feet. "What are you doing?" he asked, stepping closer. "A ceremony," she replied, her voice guarded. "For the spirits of the water, to thank them for their gift." Everett glanced at the well, then back at her. "You threw something in there." "A small offering. It will not harm your water." There was a note of defiance now, as if she expected him to forbid her practices. Instead, he nodded slowly. "My wife used to say that water was God's first miracle." He said the words coming unbidden from some long-closed chamber of his heart. "Bringing life to dust." Surprise flickered across Ayana's face at this unexpected response. "Your wife was wise." She was. Everett felt a familiar ache at the memory of Elizabeth. The fever took her and our daughter 13 years ago. There was no water that could save them then. He hadn't meant to share so much, but something about the night, the small fire with its fragrant smoke, and this woman's quiet ceremony had loosened his tongue. "I am sorry for your loss," Ayana said, and he could tell she meant it. "Among my people, we believe the spirits of loved ones stay close to water, that they speak to us in its sound." Everett looked down at the dark circle of the well. Did Elizabeth's spirit dwell there in the cool depths beneath his land? The rational part of him dismissed the notion as superstition, no different from the beliefs that had led to Ayana's ostracism. And yet, "Do what you need to," he said finally. "The well is as much yours as mine while you're here." A small acknowledgement, but one that caused Ayana's posture to relax slightly. "Thank you," she said. He left her to finish her ceremony, returning to the house with thoughts he'd long suppressed, swirling in his mind. In the morning, Everett announced his intention to ride into Meridian Crossing for supplies. "I'll need flour, coffee, some fabric, maybe, if you want to make yourself something new to wear," he said over breakfast. "Anything else we need?" Ayana looked up from her plate, clearly caught off guard by the "we" in his statement. "Salt," she said after a moment, "and perhaps needles. Mine are nearly worn through." Everett nodded. "You should come along," he added, surprising himself as much as her. "Best the town sees you properly, not through gossip and rumor." "Are you sure that is wise?" she asked carefully. "I am Apache. In town, you're with me," he interrupted. "That should be enough." A flicker of something gratitude-respect crossed her features. "Very well." They set out an hour later, Ayana riding her rested roan Everett on Buck. The journey to Meridian Crossing was mostly silent, both of them accustomed to their own company. But it wasn't an uncomfortable silence, Everett realized. There was a certain ease in traveling with someone who didn't feel the need to fill every moment with talk. As they crested the final ridge and the town came into view, a scatter of wooden buildings along a single dusty street, with the steeple of a small church rising above the rest. Everett felt Ayana tense beside him. "Stay close," he said quietly. "Let me do the talking." Meridian Crossing had grown some since his last visit, he noted as they rode down the main street. A new storefront advertised itself as a land office. The saloon had a fresh coat of paint. But the essential character of the place remained unchanged, a frontier town hanging on the edge of civilization, populated by people who were either running from something or hadn't yet managed to run far enough. Eyes followed them as they made their way to the general store. Everett could feel the curiosity, the speculation, the judgment. An Apache woman riding beside the reclusive ex-marshal who rarely showed his face in town. It would be all over Meridian Crossing before sundown. He helped Ayana dismount in front of McCready's general store, tying both horses to the hitching post. "Remember," he murmured, "you have as much right to be here as anyone." Inside the store was cool and dim after the brightness outside. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with everything from canned goods to tools, fabric, to ammunition. The proprietor, a thin man with spectacles perched on a prominent nose, looked up from his ledger as they entered. "Marshal Thorne," he greeted, using the title Everett had discarded years ago. "Been a while." "Mr. McCready." Everett nodded. "Need a few things." McCready's gaze slid to Ayana, taking in her Apache features and worn dress. To his credit, he made no comment, merely nodding. "What can I get for you today?" Everett listed their needs while Ayana moved quietly through the store, examining bolts of fabric with a careful eye. He watched as she selected a length of sturdy cotton in a deep indigo color, practical, not showy, but still an improvement over her patched dress. As McCready gathered their supplies, the bell over the door jingled, announcing another customer. Everett turned to see Sheriff Leland Dawson step inside his badge, glinting in the shaft of sunlight from the doorway. Dawson had been a deputy when Everett last wore a badge, a young man with ambition and a keen sense of which way the political winds were blowing. Now he carried himself with the authority of his office, though his eyes still held the same calculating look, Everett remembered. "Well, well," Dawson said, removing his hat. If it isn't the hermit of Agua Fria, come down from his mountain. Sheriff, Everett acknowledged with a curt nod, just picking up supplies. So I see. Dawson's gaze shifted to Ayanna, who had returned to Everett's side with the fabric clutched in her hands. And who might this be? This is Ayanna, Everett replied, deliberately omitting any explanation of her presence or relationship to him. Ayanna Sheriff Dawson. She inclined her head slightly but said nothing, her face a careful mask. Don't believe I've seen you around these parts before, ma'am. Dawson pressed his tone cordial enough, but with an undercurrent of suspicion. I arrived recently. Ayanna answered, her English clear but accented. That's so. Dawson looked back at Everett, one eyebrow raised in question. Staying long. The implication was clear. What was an Apache woman doing with the former marshal? And was it something the sheriff needed to concern himself with? She's with me, Everett said firmly, meeting Dawson's gaze with a steadiness that recalled his days of authority. That's all anyone needs to know. Dawson held his look for a moment, then shrugged, seemingly willing to let it go for now. Just making conversation. He turned his attention to MacCready. Got that package I was expecting, Tom? In the back, MacCready replied, clearly relieved by the shift in focus. I'll fetch it for you. As the storekeeper disappeared into the storeroom, Dawson leaned closer to Everett, lowering his voice. Word of advice, Thorne. Judge McCullum's been appointed to the circuit. He's cleaning up the territory, as he puts it. Real stickler for propriety. Meaning, Everett asked, though he already knew. Meaning you might want to have papers for your arrangement, Dawson replied with a meaningful glance at Ayanna. Just saying. Before Everett could respond, MacCready returned with a small parcel for the sheriff and their supplies bundled and ready. Dawson tipped his hat with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Good seeing you, Thorne, ma'am. He collected his package and stepped back into the sunlight. Everett paid for their supplies, aware of the tension that now hummed between him and Ayanna. Neither spoke until they were well outside of town, the buildings of Meridian Crossing receding behind them. What did he mean? Ayanna asked finally. About papers. Everett sighed, adjusting his hat against the glare of the afternoon sun. He meant that if you're staying with me, people will talk, and the new judge might take an interest in whether our arrangement is legal. Because I am Apache, she stated, not a question. That, and because you're a woman living on my property. He glanced at her. Folks out here can be traditional in their thinking. Ayanna processed this in silence for a while, the only sound the steady rhythm of their horses' hooves on the hard-packed trail. When she spoke again, her voice was thoughtful. When you were marshal, did you enforce such traditions? The question was unexpected, catching Everett off guard. He considered it honestly. I enforced the law, he said finally. Sometimes law and tradition overlap, sometimes they don't. And which is this? She pressed. Law or tradition? Both, maybe. He sighed. Look, Dawson was just giving me a heads up. No one's going to come riding out to Agua Fria tomorrow, demanding to see marriage papers, but it's something to be aware of. Ayanna nodded, seemingly satisfied with his answer, though he sensed there was more she wanted to say. They rode the rest of the way in contemplative silence. That night after supper, Everett sat at the table cleaning his revolver by lamplight. It was a ritual he performed every few days, breaking down the weapon, oiling each part, ensuring it was in perfect working order before reassembling it. The familiar task helped order his thoughts, which had been in turmoil since the encounter with Dawson. Across from him, Ayanna worked on her new dress, cutting the fabric with precise movements of a small knife. Her fingers moved deftly, following patterns that existed only in her mind. Why did you become a lawman? she asked, suddenly breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. Everett's hands paused in their work. It had been years since anyone had asked him about his past. "Seemed like the right thing to do at the time," he answered, resuming his task. "My father was a sheriff back in Texas. I grew up respecting the badge. And you wore it well." He looked up, caught by the genuine curiosity in her voice. "I tried to," he said honestly. "Wasn't always easy figuring out what was right. But I did my best." "Until you stopped," she observed. The question hit too close to the wound that had never fully healed. Everett reassembled the revolver with quick, practiced movements, avoiding her gaze. "That's a story for another time." To his relief, she didn't press further, returning to her sewing with the same quiet focus. But something had shifted in the air between them. A door opened, if only slightly, to conversations they had both avoided until now. Later, as Everett lay in his bunk listening to the night sounds of the desert, his thoughts returned to Dawson's warning. The sheriff had been right about one thing. A single woman living on a man's property, especially an Apache woman, would raise eyebrows. If this new judge was as zealous as Dawson suggested, it could lead to trouble. But the alternative, making their arrangement official as Ayanna had proposed upon her arrival, seemed equally fraught. Marriage meant commitment, permanence, the very things he had fled after losing Elizabeth and the baby. It meant opening himself to the possibility of loss again. And yet, as he drifted toward sleep, he found himself wondering what it would be like to no longer be alone. To have someone to share the silence with, to work beside, to build something new from the ashes of what had been lost. The thought followed him into dreams that for once were not filled with gunfire and dying. Several days later, Everett was repairing the roof of the barn, replacing shingles that had worked loose in the last windstorm, when he heard the approach of a wagon. Setting down his hammer, he moved to the edge of the roof to see who was coming. The wagon was well sprung, pulled by a matched pair of blacks that spoke of money and position. As it drew closer, he could make out a man in a dark coat sitting on the driver's seat, his posture rigid and formal. Everett climbed down quickly, brushing wood shavings from his clothes. Ayanna emerged from the garden, a basket of vegetables in her arms, her expression wary. "Stay back," he murmured as he passed her. "Let me handle this." The wagon pulled up in front of the house, and the driver set the brake before stepping down. He was a tall man, around 50, with a neatly trimmed beard and the pale complexion of someone who spent most of his time indoors. His suit, despite the dust of travel, was clearly expensive. "Mr. Thorne," he inquired, his voice cultured with an Eastern accent that seemed out of place in the Arizona territory. "That's right," Everett confirmed, his hand resting casually near his revolver. "And you are Victor Reynolds," the man replied, extending a hand that Everett didn't take. If Reynolds was offended by the snub, he didn't show it. "I represent the Arizona and Pacific Railroad Development Company." Everett felt a flicker of unease. The railroads had been pushing through the territory for years, buying up land, sometimes by fair means, sometimes not. "What brings you to Agua Fria, Mr. Reynolds?" Reynolds smiled, the expression not reaching his eyes. "I'll come straight to the point, Mr. Thorne. Our company is interested in acquiring water rights for the new spur line we're building through this region. Your well happens to be situated at a critical juncture for our operations." "My well isn't for sale," Everett said flatly. "I understand your attachment to your property," Reynolds continued smoothly. "But I assure you our company is prepared to make a very generous offer. More than fair market value." "Not interested." Everett crossed his arms. "Is that all?" Reynolds' smile tightened slightly. "I had hoped we might have a more productive conversation." He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document. Perhaps this will help you reconsider. Everett took the paper, reluctantly unfolding it, to reveal an official-looking document bearing the territorial seal. As he scanned the dense legal language, his unease grew. The document appeared to be a notice of disputed property boundaries, specifically regarding the water rights to his well. "What is this supposed to be?" he demanded. "There seems to be some confusion in the territorial records regarding the exact boundaries of your property," Reynolds explained with feigned regret. "Our research indicates that the water rights to that well may actually belong to a parcel our company has already acquired." Everett felt a surge of anger. "That's bull! I've owned this land free and clear for 8 years. The well was here when I bought it, and it's mine." "The law can be quite complex when it comes to water rights in the territory," Reynolds replied, his tone still maddeningly calm. "Especially when the original surveys were less than precise." Everett stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. "Let me be clear, Reynolds. I know a shakedown when I see one. This land is mine. That well is mine. And no amount of fancy paperwork is going to change that." For the first time, Reynolds's composure slipped slightly, a flash of something hard and cold appearing in his eyes. 20 years is a long time, Marshal Thorne, but not long enough to forget certain incidents. The use of his former title, combined with the veiled reference to the past, sent a chill down Everett's spine. Before he could respond, Ayanna stepped forward, coming to stand beside him. "The water spirits have chosen this place," she said, her voice calm but carrying. "They will not be moved by paper or greed." Reynolds's gaze shifted to her, taking in her Apache features with barely concealed disdain. "And who might this be?" "None of your concern," Everett growled. "On the contrary," Reynolds replied, his smile returning, though now it held an edge of triumph. "The presence of an unauthorized resident on your property might be of great interest to the territorial authorities, especially given the new regulations regarding tribal movements." The threat was clear. If Everett didn't cooperate regarding the well, Reynolds would make trouble for Ayanna. "You've said your piece," Everett said coldly. "Now, get off my land." Reynolds held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded slightly. "I'll give you time to reconsider, Mr. Thorne. The document I've provided explains the legal position. I suggest you study it carefully." He glanced at Ayanna. "And consider all that you might have to lose." With that, he returned to his wagon, taking up the reins. Before driving away, he called back, "I'll return in 1 week for your answer. I do hope it will be favorable, for everyone's sake." Everett watched the wagon disappear in a cloud of dust, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. Only when it was well out of sight did he allow his shoulders to slump slightly. "Who is he?" Ayanna asked quietly. "You knew him before today." Everett shook his head, the document still clutched in his hand. "No, but he knew me, or knows of me." He looked down at the paper, then back at the horizon where Reynolds had vanished. "And that makes him dangerous." "What will you do?" she pressed. Everett folded the document carefully, tucking it into his shirt pocket. "First, I need to find out if there's any truth to this claim about the water rights. That means a trip to Las Cruces to check the territorial records." "And if it is true—" "It isn't," he said firmly. "But someone's gone to a lot of trouble to make it look that way." He glanced at the well, then back at Ayanna. "You should know this changes things. If Reynolds is willing to play this dirty already, he won't stop at threats and paperwork." Ayanna met his gaze steadily. "I am not afraid." "Maybe you should be," Everett replied grimly. "I've seen what men like that are capable of when they want something badly enough." "As have I," she said. and there was something in her tone that made him look at her more closely. "But I will not run again, not this time." In that moment, standing in the harsh sunlight, with her chin lifted in defiance, Ayanna looked nothing like the frightened child he'd saved at Cedar Creek. She was a woman who had faced horrors and survived, who had made a deliberate choice to come to him, to this place. And for the first time since her arrival, Everett found himself truly believing she might be that same child grown into someone with the strength to return to the past and reclaim what had been taken from her. "All right," he said, making a decision. "We'll face this together. But first, I need to talk to someone who knows the law better than I do. And for that, we need to go back to Meridian Crossing." Judge Harlan McCoy had retired from the bench 5 years earlier, but his knowledge of territorial law remained unmatched. He lived in a small house at the edge of Meridian Crossing, surrounded by books and memories of a long career upholding the law in a place where it was often more suggestion than reality. Everett had known McCoy since his early days as a marshal, when the older man had served as both mentor and occasional conscience. They hadn't parted on the best of terms. McCoy had disapproved of Everett's decision to turn in his badge after the Sabina's incident, but there was no one else he trusted to give him honest advice about Reynolds and his claim. They reached the judge's house by late afternoon the next day, having left Agua Fria at dawn. Ayanna had insisted on accompanying him, and after some argument, Everett had relented. Better to have her where he could see her than leave her alone at the homestead where Reynolds might return. McCoy's house was a modest adobe structure, cooler than the surrounding air, thanks to its thick walls. The judge himself answered Everett's knock, his eyes widening in surprise at the sight of his visitor. "Thorne," he said, his voice gravelly with age, but still commanding. "Didn't expect to see you darken my door again." "Judge." Everett nodded. "Need your advice, if you're willing to give it." McCoy's gaze shifted to Ayanna, curiosity evident in his weathered face. "And who might this be?" "Ayanna," she answered for herself, meeting the judge's scrutiny without flinching. "I live with Mr. Thorne." McCoy's bushy eyebrows rose slightly, but he made no comment on this unexpected information. Instead, he stepped back, gesturing them inside. "Well, don't stand there letting in the heat. Come in and tell me what kind of trouble you've gotten yourself into this time." The interior of the house was dim and cluttered, every available surface covered with books, papers, and the accumulated detritus of a long life devoted to the law. McCoy cleared a stack of documents from 2 chairs, inviting them to sit. "Coffee?" he offered, already moving to the small stove in the corner. "It's not fresh, but it's strong." "That'd be fine," Everett agreed, removing his hat and placing it on his knee. As McCoy busied himself with the coffee, Everett took the opportunity to study his former mentor. The judge had aged in the years since they'd last met. His once robust frame now stooped, his hands spotted with age. But his eyes were as sharp as ever, missing nothing as they darted between his visitors. "So," McCoy said, handing them each a cup of coffee black enough to stand a spoon in "What brings the hermit of Agua Fria out of his cave." Everett withdrew Reynolds's document from his shirt pocket and handed it over. "Had a visitor yesterday. Victor Reynolds, representing the Arizona and Pacific Railroad. Claims there's some dispute over the water rights to my well." McCoy settled into his own chair with a grunt, adjusting a pair of spectacles on his nose as he examined the paper. His expression grew increasingly grim as he read. "Victor Reynolds," he muttered. "Should have known he'd turn up in these parts eventually." "You know him?" Everett asked sharply. McCoy looked up, his gaze suddenly intense. "Know of him. His reputation precedes him. Man's been involved in more land grabs than the federal government." Uses any means necessary to get what he wants. He tapped the document. This is his standard opening move. Create doubt, then offer to resolve it for a price. Is there any truth to it? Everett pressed. Could there really be a dispute about the water rights? McCoy shook his head slowly. Doubt it. The original survey of your property was done by old Bill Jenkins. Drunk half the time, but meticulous about water boundaries. He knew they'd be the source of trouble someday. He squinted at the seal on the document. This looks official enough, but I'd wager my law library it was drawn up by Reynolds' own lawyers, not the territorial office. So it's a bluff, Everett concluded, feeling a measure of relief. A bluff with teeth, McCoy corrected him. Reynolds doesn't make empty threats. If he wants that well, he'll use every trick in the book to get it. He glanced at Ayanna, including, I suspect, making trouble for your companion here. Ayanna, who had been quietly sipping her coffee, met the judge's gaze directly. I am not afraid of such men, she said. I have faced worse. McCoy studied her with new interest. I don't doubt that, young lady, but the law in this territory isn't always kind to your people, especially when powerful interests are involved. What can we do? Everett asked, bringing the conversation back to the matter at hand. McCoy stroked his beard thoughtfully. First, strengthen your claim. Make sure all your papers are in order. I can help with that. He paused, his gaze moving between Everett and Ayanna. Second, consider formalizing your arrangement. Meaning, Everett asked, though he already knew, meaning that a married couple with a properly registered homestead is harder to dislodge than a single man with an ambiguous relationship to his household, McCoy replied bluntly. A family home carries weight in territorial law that a bachelor's claim doesn't. Ayanna's expression remained impassive, but Everett felt her gaze on him, waiting for his response. That's a big step, Judge, he said carefully. So is fighting the railroad, McCoy countered. You have to decide what matters most to you, Thorne, the land or your solitude. The question hung in the air between them, challenging Everett to examine priorities he had taken for granted for years. Before he could formulate a response, McCoy continued. Think on it. In the meantime, I'll look into this document, see if there's any substance to Reynolds's claim. He handed the paper back to Everett. Come back tomorrow. I'll have more information for you then. Recognizing the dismissal, Everett rose, placing his empty cup on a precarious stack of books. Thank you, Judge. We appreciate the help. Don't thank me yet. McCoy grunted. Reynolds isn't a man to cross lightly. Whatever you decide, be prepared for a fight. As they stepped back into the late afternoon sun, Everett felt the weight of the judge's words settling on his shoulders. A fight was coming, whether he wanted it or not, and the outcome would determine not just the fate of his land, but the course of whatever future lay ahead for him, and now it seemed for Ayanna as well. They secured rooms at the small hotel in Meridian Crossing, separate, but adjoining a concession to propriety that felt strangely important, given the conversation with McCoy. As night fell, Everett stood at the window of his room, looking out at the scattered lights of the town, thoughts churning. A soft knock at the connecting door interrupted his brooding. He opened it to find Ayanna standing there, her expression solemn in the lamplight. "May I speak with you?" she asked. Everett stepped back, gesturing for her to enter. She did so with characteristic grace, moving to stand by the window where he had been. "The judge spoke of marriage," she said without preamble, "as I did when I first came to you." He did, Everett acknowledged, unsure where this conversation was heading. "I want you to know," she continued, her gaze steady, "that I did not come seeking only protection, or only a place to belong." She paused as if gathering courage. I came because I remembered the man who saved a child when no one else would, because I believed such a man would be honorable. Everett felt something shift inside him, a warmth he had not allowed himself to feel in years. Ayanna, let me finish, she interrupted gently. I do not ask for love. I know that belongs to your wife who is gone. But I ask for partnership, for respect, for a chance to build something that neither of us could build alone. The simple dignity of her words struck him deeply. This was not a desperate plea, but an offer made from a position of strength, despite all she had endured. Why me? He asked the question that had haunted him since her arrival. There must have been others, younger men, who would have welcomed you. A shadow crossed her face. There were those who wanted to use me, yes, but none who saw me as a person, not just an Apache woman, to be possessed. She looked away out at the night. You saw me even as a child. You risked yourself for someone who had no claim on you. That is rare in this world. Everett was silent for a long moment, absorbing her words. Then, moving to stand beside her at the window, he spoke quietly. There's something you should know about why I left the badge behind. She turned to look at him, waiting. After my wife and daughter died, I threw myself into the job, took more risks, cared less about my own safety. His voice was low, almost a confession. Then came Sabina's. A bank robbery gone wrong. 3 men dead by my gun, including a bystander caught in the crossfire. He closed his eyes briefly. A boy no more than 16. Wrong place, wrong time. It was not your fault, Ayanna said softly. Maybe not, but it was my responsibility. He opened his eyes, meeting her gaze directly. I couldn't wear the badge after that. Couldn't trust myself to make the right choices, so I left it all behind. Bought agua fria. Decided I was better off alone, where I couldn't hurt anyone but myself. And now? She asked. Do you still believe that? Everett considered the question honestly. I don't know, he admitted, but I do know that Reynolds won't stop at papers and threats. And I know that whatever happens next, I don't want you caught in the crossfire. I have already been caught, Ayanna replied with quiet certainty. The moment I chose to come to you, I accepted whatever would follow. She placed her hand on his arm, the touch light but firm. We face this together, whether as man and wife, or as two who share a common enemy. Looking into her eyes, Everett saw not the frightened child from Cedar Creek, but a woman of remarkable strength and clarity of purpose, someone who had made her choice with open eyes, knowing the risks. All right, he said finally, together, but let's hear what McCoy finds out before making any decisions about the rest. Ayanna nodded, seemingly satisfied with this answer. She withdrew her hand, but remained standing beside him, both of them looking out at the night, the silence between them now comfortable, almost companionable. Whatever came next, Everett realized he was no longer facing it alone. And that thought surprisingly brought more comfort than fear. Morning came to Meridian Crossing with the sound of wagons already rolling down the main street, bringing goods and gossip in equal measure. Everett woke early, his body accustomed to rising with the sun, despite the unfamiliar surroundings of the hotel room. For a moment, he lay still, listening to the town coming to life outside his window. This had once been his world. The rhythm of commerce, the murmur of voices, the steady pulse of civilization pushing ever westward. Now it felt foreign, almost intrusive, after years of desert silence. He rose and dressed quickly, checking his revolver with the same care he always did. Old habits died hard, especially those forged in years of watching for trouble. A soft knock at the connecting door announced Ayana's presence. She entered at his invitation already dressed, her hair braided neatly. He noted that she had done her best to make her worn dress presentable, brushing away the dust of travel and mending a tear in the sleeve. The new fabric they had purchased remained carefully folded in her saddlebag, awaiting her return to Agua Fria. "Did you sleep?" she asked, her dark eyes taking in the shadows beneath his own. "Some," he admitted. It wasn't entirely a lie. He had slept but fitfully, his dreams filled with images of Reynolds's smiling face and the well running dry, the land cracking and dying around it. They breakfasted at the small cafe adjacent to the hotel, ignoring the curious stares of other patrons. Everett was accustomed to such attention. The former marshal who had retreated to the wilderness was bound to draw speculation when he reappeared in town with an Apache woman at his side. But he noted with quiet appreciation that Ayana faced the scrutiny without flinching, her posture straight, her movements deliberate and composed. "You navigate their world well," he observed as they walked toward Judge McCoy's house afterward. "I have had practice," she replied simply. "One learns to move among those who see only your skin, not your spirit." The statement, delivered without bitterness or self-pity, gave Everett pause. How many times had she been forced to endure such judgments? How had she managed to retain her dignity in the face of it? Before he could pursue the thought, they arrived at the judge's house. McCoy answered their knock promptly, as if he had been waiting for them. His expression was grave, his usual gruffness tempered by something that looked suspiciously like concern. "Come in," he said, stepping aside. "Got some information you need to hear." Inside the judge's house was as cluttered as the day before, but Everett noticed a stack of documents on the table that hadn't been there previously. Maps and legal papers were spread out, some yellowed with age, others crisp and new. "Sit," McCoy instructed, pouring coffee without asking if they wanted any. "Been doing some digging on your visitor, Thorne, Victor Reynolds." "And," Everett prompted, accepting the cup. McCoy settled into his chair with a sigh. "And it's worse than I thought. Reynolds isn't just any railroad agent. He's got a personal stake in this." "How so?" The judge's eyes, rheumy with age, but still sharp, fixed on Everett. "The name doesn't ring any bells. Think back. Cedar Creek, 20 years ago." Everett felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "Reynolds," he repeated slowly. "There was a trader at Cedar Creek, selling guns to both sides. Nathan Reynolds." "Victor's brother," McCoy confirmed grimly. "Nathan was killed in the raid, shot trying to escape, according to the official report." He glanced at Ayana, whose face had gone very still. "No offense intended, miss." "None taken," she replied quietly, though her hands had tightened around her coffee cup. "The trader was not well regarded by my people either. He cheated many." McCoy nodded. "From what I've been able to piece together, Victor has been tracking you for years, Thorne, waiting for the right moment. The railroad job gives him the perfect cover and resources to finally settle what he sees as a score. Everett absorbed this information in silence, his mind racing back to that day at Cedar Creek. He had been a young deputy then, part of a posse responding to reports of raids along the border. What they found instead was a powder keg of tensions between settlers' Apache bands and opportunists like Nathan Reynolds, who profited from the conflict. The raid had erupted into chaos, with shots fired from all directions. In the midst of it, Everett had found the child Ayana hiding beneath an overturned wagon. He remembered carrying her to safety, even as bullets tore through the air around them. But Nathan Reynolds. His memory of the traitor was vague at best, just another casualty in a day filled with death. "You're saying this is personal," Everett said finally. "Reynolds wants my land because of what happened to his brother." "That's my read," McCoy agreed. "The water rights dispute is just a pretext. What he really wants is to run you off the land you've built to take what matters to you." His gaze shifted between Everett and Ayanna. "And now it seems he's found another lever to use against you." Ayanna met the judge's look steadily. "I am not afraid of such men," she said, echoing her words from the day before. "Maybe you should be," McCoy replied, not unkindly. "Victor Reynolds has a reputation for ruthlessness that makes his brother look like a choir boy, and he's been nursing this grudge for 2 decades. "What about the document he gave me?" Everett asked, returning to practical matters. "Is there any legal standing to his claim?" McCoy shuffled through the papers on his table, extracting a map marked with property boundaries. "I checked the original survey records. The well sits squarely on your property, no question. The water rights are yours." He tapped another document. "But Reynolds has friends in high places. He's managed to get a hearing scheduled with Judge McCullum next month to review the claim. And this McCullum, he's the one Dawson mentioned, the stickler for propriety." "The same," McCoy confirmed with a grimace. "New to the territory, eager to make his mark. Sees himself as a civilizing influence on the frontier." He gave Everett a pointed look. "The kind of man who might take issue with certain living arrangements." The implication was clear. If Reynolds couldn't take the well through legal means, he would use Ayanna's presence to apply pressure, perhaps even having her removed from the territory under the various laws restricting Apache movement. "So we're back to the same solution," Everett said slowly. "Formalize the arrangement. Make it harder for them to separate us from the land or from each other." "That's one option," McCoy agreed. "A strong one, legally speaking. A married couple with an established homestead has rights that are hard to challenge even for the railroad." He paused, studying Everett's face. "But it's not a step to take lightly, as I said yesterday." Everett glanced at Ayanna, who had been silent during this exchange. Her expression revealed little, but there was a tension in her shoulders that hadn't been there before. "There's something else you should know," McCoy continued. "While I was asking around about Reynolds, I heard rumors that he's been hiring men, the kind who wear their guns low and don't ask questions about the work." He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "Whatever you decide, Thorne, you need to be prepared for the possibility that Reynolds won't wait for the law to take its course." The warning hung in the air between them, its implications clear. Reynolds was preparing for a fight, perhaps a violent one. "Thank you, Judge," Everett said, finally rising from his chair. "You've given us a lot to think about." "Don't thank me," McCoy replied gruffly. "Just be careful. Reynolds has had 20 years to plan his revenge. Don't underestimate what he might do to get it." They left the judge's house with the weight of his words pressing down on them. Neither spoke as they walked back toward the hotel, each lost in their own thoughts. The busy street around them seemed suddenly more threatening. Every stranger, a potential ally of Reynolds. Every glance, a possible assessment of their vulnerabilities. As they passed the saloon, a burst of raucous laughter spilled out onto the street, along with a man who stumbled through the bat-wing doors. He collided with Ayanna, knocking her slightly off balance. "Watch where you're—" The man's words cut off as he registered her Apache features. His face, already flushed with drink, darkened further. "What's a squaw doing in town?" he demanded, loud enough to draw stares from passers-by. Everett stepped between them, his hand moving instinctively toward his revolver. "Move along, friend," he said, his voice low but carrying the unmistakable edge of warning. The lady's with me. The man squinted at him, recognition slowly dawning through the alcoholic haze. You're that ex-marshal, ain't you, Thorne? His gaze slid back to Ayanna, then to Everett again, a sneer forming. Didn't take you for an Injun lover. Before Everett could respond, Sheriff Dawson appeared seemingly from nowhere, his badge catching the morning light. Problem here, gentlemen? He inquired mildly, though his hand rested casually on his own revolver. No problem, Everett replied, not taking his eyes off the drunk. Just a misunderstanding. The drunk spat in the dust, but something in Dawson's posture, or perhaps Everett's, convinced him to back down. No misunderstanding, he muttered. Just surprised to see what passes for company these days. He lurched back toward the saloon, disappearing through the batwing doors. Charming fellow, Dawson observed dryly. His gaze shifted to Everett. You might want to consider heading back to Agua Fria soon, Thorne. Town's getting a bit restless with certain visitors lately. His eyes flicked to Ayanna, then back. Just a friendly suggestion. Appreciated, Everett said, though his tone suggested otherwise. We'll be on our way shortly. Dawson tipped his hat and continued down the street, but Everett couldn't shake the feeling that the encounter had been less coincidental than it appeared. News traveled fast in small towns, and their meeting with Judge McCoy was unlikely to have gone unnoticed. He knows about Reynolds, Ayanna said quietly, as they resumed walking. Everett nodded. Seems that way. Question is, which side is he on? His own, she replied with certainty. Men like him watch to see which way the wind blows before taking a stand. It was an astute observation, one that aligned with Everett's own assessment of the sheriff. Dawson had always been politically careful to curry favor with whoever held power. If Reynolds was gaining influence in the territory, Dawson would be careful not to cross him. They reached the hotel and climbed the stairs to their rooms in silence. Only when they were safely behind closed doors did Everett speak. McCoy's right. This is worse than we thought. If Reynolds has been tracking me all these years, he won't stop at legal maneuvering or threats. Ayanna watched him with those steady eyes that seemed to see more than he sometimes wanted to reveal. What will you do? She asked. Everett ran a hand through his hair, weighing their options. We go back to Agua Fria, he decided. Prepare for whatever comes next. If Reynolds wants a fight, we'll be ready for it. He paused, looking at her directly. But you should know what you're getting into. This isn't just about water rights anymore, it's about revenge. I already knew, she said simply. How could you know about Reynolds and his brother? Everett asked, surprised. I didn't know the name, she admitted. But I knew there was more to your story than you had told me, just as there is more to mine than I have told you. There was something in her tone that made Everett pause, a hint of a secret kept not out of deceit, but out of necessity, or perhaps pain. What haven't you told me, Ayanna? He asked quietly. She moved to the window, looking out at the dusty street below. For a long moment she was silent, as if gathering her thoughts or her courage. The traitor, she said finally, Reynolds's brother. He did more than sell guns to both sides. She turned back to face him, her expression carefully controlled. He took women, girls, from the raids, sold them to men in the mining camps or kept them for himself. Everett felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. And you? No, she interrupted. Not me, but my mother's sister. She was taken before the raid at Cedar Creek. We never saw her again. Her voice remained steady, but her hands had clenched at her sides. When the warriors learned what he was doing, they wanted revenge. That was part of why they attacked that day. The revelation cast the events at Cedar Creek in a new light. What Everett had witnessed as seemingly senseless violence had been, at least in part, retaliation for very real crimes, crimes that the law, His law as a deputy had failed to prevent or punish. "I didn't know," he said, the words inadequate even as he spoke them. "Few did," Ayanna replied. "Such things were not spoken of openly. But I tell you now so you understand this man Reynolds. He comes from blood that has already harmed my people. I have reason to stand against him that goes beyond your land or your well." Everett crossed to her, stopping just short of touching her. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" "Would you have believed me?" she asked simply. "When I first came to you, I was a stranger. A memory, perhaps, but not someone you trusted. And now—" The question hung between them, loaded with implications neither was ready to fully articulate. Ayanna met his gaze steadily. "Now we face a common enemy," she said. "Trust must begin somewhere." Something shifted in Everett's chest, a loosening of a knot he had carried so long he had forgotten it was there. Trust. How long had it been since he had truly trusted anyone? Since Elizabeth's death, he had kept the world at arm's length, convinced that connection only led to loss. Yet here stood this woman offering trust as simply as she might offer water to a thirsty traveler. "We should go," he said finally, unable to find words for the emotions churning within him. "It's a long ride back to Agua Fria, and I want to be there before dark." They gathered their few belongings and settled their bill at the hotel, then collected their horses from the livery stable. As they prepared to mount up, Everett caught sight of a familiar figure watching from the doorway of the land office across the street. Victor Reynolds stood in the shadow of the awning, his expression unreadable at this distance. But even from here, Everett could feel the weight of his gaze, the calculation behind it. He made no move to approach them, no gesture of acknowledgement. He simply watched, like a predator assessing its prey. Everett touched Ayanna's arm, nodding slightly in Reynolds's direction. She followed his gaze, her body tensing almost imperceptibly. "He wants us to see him," she murmured. "Yes," Everett agreed. "Wants us to know he's watching, trying to unsettle us." Without further discussion, they mounted their horses and rode out of Meridian Crossing, heading back toward the isolated sanctuary of Agua Fria. But the weight of Reynolds's gaze seemed to follow them, a silent promise that their sanctuary would not remain undisturbed for long. The journey back was tense, both of them scanning the horizon frequently for signs of pursuit or ambush. Everett's years as a marshal had taught him the value of vigilance, and Ayanna's own experiences had clearly honed similar instincts. They spoke little, conserving energy and attention for the trail ahead. By mid-afternoon, the familiar landscape of Agua Fria came into view: the low adobe house, the barn, the corral, where Everett's few cattle grazed. And at the center of it all, the well that had become the focus of Reynolds's attention. As they drew closer, Everett noticed something was amiss. The door to the house stood slightly ajar when he was certain he had closed it securely before they left. He raised a hand, signaling Ayanna to stop. "Wait here," he said quietly, drawing his revolver. "Something's not right." But Ayanna shook her head, sliding from her horse with fluid grace. "Together," she reminded him, retrieving a knife from her saddlebag, a blade longer and sharper than the one she used for daily tasks. Recognizing the futility of arguing, Everett dismounted as well. They approached the house, cautiously alert for any sound or movement that might indicate danger. The interior was dim after the brightness outside, and it took a moment for Everett's eyes to adjust. When they did, he felt a surge of cold anger. The house had been searched thoroughly, and without care for the disruption left behind. His few possessions were scattered drawers emptied onto the floor, the mattress of his bunk slashed, and its straw filling spilled out. "Reynolds?" Ayanna said, not a question, but a confirmation. "Or his men," Everett agreed grimly. "Check the barn." See if they got to your things as well." She nodded and slipped out, knife still in hand. Everett continued his assessment of the damage. Nothing appeared to be missing. This had not been a robbery, but a message. A violation of his space, his privacy, his security. Another move in the game Reynolds was playing. Near his bunk, he noticed something that made his breath catch. The small wooden box where he kept Elizabeth's wedding ring and a lock of her hair lay open, its contents exposed. The ring was still there, the simple gold band dull in the shadowed light. But the lock of hair was gone. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Reynolds hadn't just been searching for legal documents or valuables. He had been looking for something personal, something that would hurt. Ayanna returned her expression, confirming what he already suspected. "The barn, too," she said. "They took nothing but—" She hesitated. "But what?" Everett prompted. "The medicine pouch I carried from my mother. It is gone." The theft of such intimate mementos was a violation beyond the physical disruption of their home. It was a calculated cruelty designed to wound on the deepest level. "I'm sorry," Everett said, the words woefully inadequate. Ayanna's face remained composed, but there was a new tension in her jawline. "It is not your fault," she replied. "Men like Reynolds understand the power of such things. The spirits of our ancestors, the memories we carry, they give us strength. He seeks to weaken us by taking them." Her understanding of their adversaries' tactics was unsettlingly accurate. Reynolds was striking not just at their legal claim to the land, but at the emotional foundations of their resistance. "We'll set things right," Everett promised, though he wasn't sure how. The lock of Elizabeth's hair was irreplaceable, as was Ayanna's medicine pouch. Some violations could not be undone. They spent the remainder of the day restoring order to the house and barn, working together in a silence that grew more comfortable as the hours passed. Everett replaced the straw in his mattress, while Ayanna swept the floor clean of the debris left by the intruders. They righted overturned furniture, reorganized scattered possessions, reclaimed the space that had been violated. By evening, physical order had been restored, though the sense of security that had once pervaded the isolated homestead remained fractured. They ate a simple supper of beans and cornbread, the familiar meal, bringing a small measure of normalcy to a day that had been anything but normal. "What will you do?" Ayanna asked, as they finished the question that had hovered unspoken between them all day, finally finding voice. Everett looked at her across the table, noting the steadiness of her gaze despite the day's events. "What will we do, you mean?" he corrected quietly. "This involves both of us now." Something flickered in her eyes, surprise, perhaps, or a deeper emotion he couldn't quite name. She nodded, accepting the correction. "First," Everett continued, "we secure the house better. Set up watches at least until we know what Reynolds's next move will be." He paused, considering their options. "And we need allies. I know a few people in the territory who might be willing to stand with us if things get worse." "And the judge's suggestion," Ayanna asked carefully, "about formalizing our arrangement." The question hung in the air between them, weighted with implications beyond the legal protection such a step might provide. Everett found himself studying her face in the lamplight, the proud line of her cheekbones, the quiet strength in her dark eyes, the dignity that had survived all the hardships she had endured. "I think," he said slowly, "that whatever we decide, it should be for reasons beyond Reynolds and his threats. Marriage is—" He hesitated, memories of Elizabeth threatening to overwhelm him. "Marriage should be more than a legal strategy." Ayanna's expression softened slightly. "Among my people, marriage is about partnership. Two who are stronger together than apart." She looked down at her hands, calloused from work, but still graceful. I did not come to you seeking love, Everett Thorne. I came seeking a place where I could belong, where my work would have meaning, where I would not be cast aside. The honesty of her statement touched something deep within him. How long had it been since he had truly belonged anywhere, since the work of his hands had meant more than mere survival? "Let's take the night to think on it," he said finally. "Tomorrow is soon enough to decide." She nodded, accepting his caution without offense. "I will take first watch," she offered, rising from the table. "You need rest." Everett wanted to protest, to insist that he should be the one keeping guard. But the events of the past few days had indeed left him bone-weary, and he had seen enough of Ayana's capabilities to know she was more than capable of alerting him to any danger.
"Wake me in 4 hours,"
he agreed, surrendering to the fatigue that pulled at his limbs. "Sooner, if you hear anything suspicious." She nodded again and moved to the door, taking up a position on the porch where she would have a clear view of the approach to the house. Everett watched her go, struck once more by the quiet grace of her movements, the composed dignity she maintained even in the face of danger and loss. He lay down on his repaired bunk, fully clothed, except for his boots, his revolver within easy reach. Despite his exhaustion, sleep was slow to come. His mind circled the events of the past days, searching for patterns, for strategies, for some way to protect what was his, and now, it seemed, what was theirs. Sometime in the night, he dreamed of Cedar Creek again, but this time the dream was different. Instead of chaos and gunfire, he saw Ayana as a child looking up at him with those same steady eyes. And behind her, watching with an expression of terrible recognition, stood Victor Reynolds, holding his brother's body, his face contorted with a grief that had curdled into hatred. Everett woke with a start, his hand already reaching for his revolver before consciousness fully returned. The house was quiet, the only sound the soft creak of the chair on the porch where Ayana kept her vigil. He lay back, his heart gradually slowing its panicked rhythm. The dream lingered, its images too vivid to dismiss as mere fantasy. Had Reynolds been there that day at Cedar Creek? Had he witnessed his brother's death? The thought was unsettling, adding a new dimension to the man's vendetta. Not just revenge for a brother's death, but vengeance for a loss witnessed firsthand. Unable to return to sleep, Everett rose and moved to the door. Outside, the night was clear, stars scattered across the vast dome of the sky like diamond dust. Ayana sat in the old wooden chair, her profile outlined against the darkness. "You should be resting," she said, without turning, somehow aware of his presence despite his silent approach. "Couldn't sleep," he admitted, settling on the porch step beside her chair. "Bad dreams." "The raid?" she asked, her voice soft in the darkness. "Yes," he replied, "but different this time. Reynolds was there, Victor, not just his brother." He glanced up at her. "Do you remember if he was at Cedar Creek?" Ayana was silent for a long moment, considering the question. "I do not know," she said finally. "Everything from that day is fragmented in my memory. Smoke, gunfire, you carrying me away." She paused. "But the judge seemed certain that Victor blames you for his brother's death. Perhaps he was there. Perhaps he only heard the story later and built his hatred on that foundation. Either way," Everett sighed, "he's had 20 years to nurse that grudge. Makes him dangerous." "All men with long-held grievances are dangerous," Ayana observed quietly. "They become blind to everything but their own pain." The insight struck Everett as profound, especially coming from someone who had endured far more injustice than Reynolds ever had. Yet Ayana had not allowed her own suffering to consume her, to warp her into someone driven solely by bitterness or revenge. "How did you survive it?" He asked the question, emerging unbidden from some deep place within him. Not just physically, but sighed. How did you not let it break you? She looked down at him, her face half in shadow, half illuminated by starlight. Who says I am not broken? She asked softly. We all carry our scars. Everett Thorne, some visible, some hidden. She touched her shoulder where he knew the marks of the whip lay beneath her dress. But being broken does not mean being destroyed. Sometimes what breaks allows new strength to grow. The words resonated with something Everett had felt, but never articulated the sense that his own brokenness after Elizabeth's death, after Sabina's, had somehow become integral to who he was now. Not a wound that had healed cleanly, but a break that had mended stronger at the seam. When I first came to you, Ayanna continued, I said I was the Apache child you saved. But perhaps it is more true to say I am what that child became after years of learning to survive. She looked out into the darkness surrounding the homestead. Just as you are not the same Marshal who carried me to safety, but what that man became after his own trials. The observation was startlingly accurate. They were both shaped by their pasts, but not defined by them. Changed, but not erased. It's almost dawn, Everett noted watching as the eastern horizon began to lighten almost imperceptibly. Try to get some rest. I'll keep watch now. Ayanna nodded, rising from the chair with the fluid grace that characterized her movements. But before entering the house, she paused, looking back at him. Whatever we decide, she said quietly, know that I am here by choice, not just because I had nowhere else to go, but because I chose to find you, to remember the man who once showed kindness when there was no reason to do so. With that, she slipped inside, leaving Everett alone with the approaching dawn and the weight of her words settling around him like a mantle. Choice. How long had it been since he had truly chosen anything, rather than simply reacting to circumstances withdrawing further into isolation with each new hurt? The day broke clear and hot, the sun climbing into a sky devoid of clouds. Everett spent the morning reinforcing the locks on the doors and windows, while Ayanna tended to the animals and the small garden patch. They worked with the easy coordination of those accustomed to shared labor, each anticipating the other's needs without unnecessary words. By midday, the heat had become oppressive, driving them into the shade of the porch. They sat side by side on the steps, drinking water from tin cups, watching as heat shimmers distorted the distant landscape. The well is strong today, Ayanna observed, looking toward the stone structure at the center of the homestead. The water spirits are generous. Everett followed her gaze. The well had always been the heart of Agua Fria, the reason the land was habitable at all in this harsh environment. Without it, everything else, the house, the barn, the small herd of cattle, would be meaningless. There's an underwater spring that feeds it, he explained. Never runs dry even in the worst droughts. That's why Reynolds wants it so badly. Water like that is worth more than gold out here. Ayanna nodded thoughtfully. Among my people there are stories of sacred springs, places where the water comes from the heart of the earth itself. Such places have power beyond quenching thirst or growing crops. What kind of power? Everett asked, curious despite his natural skepticism of such beliefs. Healing, she replied simply. Renewal, the power to wash away the past and make room for what is to come. She glanced at him. Your people speak of baptism, yes, rebirth through water. It is not so different. The comparison caught Everett off guard. He had not thought of religion in years, not since the fever took Elizabeth and the baby despite all his desperate prayers. Yet there was truth in what Ayanna said. Water had always held symbolic power across cultures and beliefs. "Is that why you performed that ceremony at the well?" he asked, remembering the night he had found her with the small fire and the medicine pouch now lost to Reynolds's violation. "For renewal?" "Partly," she acknowledged. "And to thank the spirits for leading me to this place. To you." She paused, her expression growing more serious. "There is something I have not told you about the well." Everett tensed slightly, uncertain what revelation might be coming. "What about it?" "The night you found me performing the ceremony," she began, "I was not only giving thanks. I was seeking guidance." Her dark eyes met his directly. "In the old stories of my mother's people there is a tale of a great underground river that flows beneath this land. A river so vast it could sustain entire nations if its course were known." "You believe such a river exists?" Everett asked, trying to keep the skepticism from his voice. "I know only what the stories tell," she replied, "but I believe your well may connect to it. That is why it never runs dry, even when all around is parched." Everett considered this. From a practical standpoint, the existence of an underground aquifer would explain the well's remarkable consistency. But he sensed Ayanna was telling him this for reasons beyond geological curiosity. "Why are you sharing this now?" he asked. "Because," she said quietly, "if such a river exists, and if Reynolds gains control of this land, he would hold power over more than just agua fria. He would command a resource that rightly belongs to all who live in this territory." She looked toward the distant mountains, "including my people who have already lost so much." The implication was clear. Their stand against Reynolds was about more than personal grievances or even the fate of one homestead. It was about preventing a man driven by vengeance from controlling a resource vital to the entire region. "You believe the railroad's interest is genuine, then?" Everett asked. "Not just a cover for Reynolds's personal vendetta?" "I believe both can be true," Ayanna replied thoughtfully. "The railroad needs water for its operations. Reynolds needs revenge for his brother. Their interests align, making them dangerous allies." The assessment was astute, demonstrating once again Ayanna's sharp intelligence and her understanding of the complex motivations that drove men like Reynolds. Before Everett could respond, a distant sound caught his attention. The approach of horses, more than one, moving at a steady pace toward the homestead. He rose, hand moving to his revolver. "Company," he said tersely. "Get inside." But Ayanna remained seated, shading her eyes to peer into the distance. "Not Reynolds," she said with surprising certainty. "Look at how they ride. Open, not trying to conceal their approach." Everett had to admit she was right. Whoever was coming made no attempt at stealth or surprise, riding directly toward the house along the main trail. As they drew closer, he recognized the lead rider with a mixture of relief and wariness. "Judge McCoy," he said, relaxing his stance slightly, though his hand remained near his weapon. "And that's Sheriff Dawson with him." Ayanna rose now, standing beside him on the porch as the riders approached. Besides McCoy and Dawson, there were two others Everett didn't recognize, younger men, well-dressed, despite the dust of travel, with the look of clerks or officials, rather than gunmen. The small party reined in before the house, McCoy lifting his hat in greeting. "Thorne," he called. "Hope you don't mind the unexpected visit." "Depends on what brings you," Everett replied cautiously. McCoy dismounted with the stiffness of age, accepting Dawson's help to steady himself as his feet touched the ground. "Information," he said, climbing the porch steps with careful dignity. "And perhaps a warning." Everett glanced at the other riders who remained mounted, their expressions professionally neutral. "Who are your friends, Mr. Davis and Mr. Wheeler?" McCoy introduced them with a nod. "From the Territorial Land Office. I persuaded them to make the journey to verify some records." There was a hint of satisfaction in the old judge's voice, suggesting this had not been an easy task. "You'd better come inside," Everett said, gesturing toward the door. "It's too hot to stand around talking in the sun." McCoy nodded gratefully, but Dawson hesitated. "I'll keep an eye on things out here," he said, his gaze scanning the surrounding landscape. "Make sure we weren't followed." The statement confirmed what Everett had already suspected: their visit was not routine and potentially dangerous for all involved. Inside the house, Everett noted McCoy's sharp glance around the still disordered interior. The judge had always been observant, and the signs of the recent intrusion were still evident despite their efforts to restore order. "You've had visitors," McCoy stated, not a question. "Reynolds or his men," Everett confirmed grimly. "Came while we were in town. Tore the place apart, took some personal items." McCoy's bushy eyebrows drew together in a scowl. "Moving faster than I expected," he muttered. "That's not good, Thorne." "What's your news?" Everett asked, getting directly to the point. McCoy settled into a chair at the table, removing his hat and placing it carefully before him. "After you left yesterday, I had Mr. Davis and Mr. Wheeler here check the territorial records more thoroughly. The official ones, not the copies Reynolds presented." He glanced at Ayanna, who stood quietly near the door. "What they found confirms what I suspected. Your water rights are solid, Thorne. The well and all that flows from it belong to this property, and this property belongs to you." "That's something, at least," Everett acknowledged. "But I'm guessing there's more, or you wouldn't have ridden all this way to tell me." "Indeed." McCoy's expression grew more grave. "Reynolds has already filed a petition with Judge McCullum to review the claim. The hearing is set for 2 weeks from now, not a month, as I initially thought." "He's pushing things forward," Everett observed. "Why the rush?" "That's where the warning comes in," McCoy replied. "Word in town is that Reynolds has been making substantial investments in the Territorial Bank, extending loans to key businesses, buying interests in several profitable ventures. Building influence," Everett translated. "Precisely, and not just economic influence. He's been seen dining with Judge McCullum on multiple occasions, hosting him at that fancy house he's rented at the edge of town." McCoy leaned forward, lowering his voice, though there was no one to overhear. "McCullum is ambitious, Thorne. Rumors say he's eyeing an appointment to the Territorial Supreme Court. The kind of appointment that requires powerful friends and considerable financial backing." The implication was clear. Reynolds was positioning himself to influence the very judge who would decide the fate of Agua Fria's water rights. "So the hearing is just for show," Everett concluded bitterly. "The decision's already been bought and paid for." "Not necessarily," McCoy countered. "McCullum is ambitious, yes, but he's also concerned with appearances. He wants to be seen as a fair and impartial judge, even as he curries favor with men like Reynolds." The old judge glanced at Ayanna again. "Which brings me back to my suggestion from yesterday. A legally recognized homestead with a proper family established on it carries significant weight in territorial law. Even a judge as ambitious as McCullum would hesitate to rule against such an established claim without very compelling evidence." "And my being Apache," Ayanna asked quietly, "would that not weigh against us in such a judge's eyes?" McCoy didn't sugarcoat his response. "It might," he admitted. "But the territorial statutes recognize legal marriages regardless of race, particularly when they result in productive use of the land." He gestured toward the window where the small garden and well-maintained buildings were visible. "What you've built here together matters in the eyes of the law." Everett caught the subtle emphasis on "together," though he and Ayanna had in fact been sharing the work of Agua Fria for only a short time. But McCoy was right. In those weeks, the homestead had flourished under their combined efforts in ways it never had during his years of solitary existence. "I need to speak with Ayanna privately," Everett said, coming to a decision. "Can you give us a moment, Judge?" McCoy nodded, rising from his chair with the careful movements of age. "I'll step outside, see what Dawson's found." At the door, he paused, looking back at them. "Whatever you decide, don't take too long. Reynolds is moving quickly, and you should too." When the door closed behind him, Everett turned to Ayanna. She stood by the window, her profile outlined against the bright rectangle of light, her expression thoughtful but unreadable. "You heard what McCoy said," he began. "Marriage would strengthen our legal position, give us a better chance of keeping the land and the well." "Yes," she agreed quietly. "But you said yesterday that marriage should be more than a legal strategy." Everett moved closer, stopping just short of touching her. "I meant that," he said. "And I've been thinking about what you said about partnership, about being stronger together than apart." He paused, searching for words to express the shift that had occurred within him. "When I found Elizabeth's hair missing, taken by Reynolds's men, I felt violated, angry, but also something else." "What?" Ayanna asked, turning to face him fully. "Relief," he admitted the word, catching slightly in his throat. "Relief that I could still feel that deeply about anything. For years I've been numb, surviving but not living. Then you arrived, and suddenly everything is sharper, clearer. I feel again, Ayanna. Anger, fear, but also," he hesitated, "also hope. For the first time in a long time." Something softened in her expression, a vulnerability she rarely allowed herself to show. "I did not come seeking love," she reminded him, echoing her words from the night before. "Only a place to belong." "I know," Everett said. "And I can't promise love not yet. Elizabeth will always be part of me." He glanced toward the small wooden box where her ring still lay. "But I can promise partnership, respect, a shared purpose." He met Ayanna's dark eyes directly. "If that's enough for you, then yes, I think we should do as McCoy suggests. Make our arrangement official, not just for legal protection, but because I want you to stay, Ayanna. Whatever happens with Reynolds, with the well, with all of it, I want you here." The words hung in the air between them, more of a commitment than Everett had made to anyone since Elizabeth's death. For a long moment, Ayanna was silent, her gaze steady on his face, as if searching for any hint of hesitation or insincerity. "It is enough," she said finally, her voice soft but certain. "More than I hoped for when I first came to you." Something shifted between them, then a tension releasing, a new understanding taking its place. Everett reached out, taking her hand in his, the first time he had touched her with any real intent beyond the casual contact of shared work. "Then we'll tell McCoy to make the arrangements," he said, "and face whatever comes next together." Ayanna's hand tightened around his, her grip strong, despite her slender fingers. "Together," she agreed. They stood that way for a moment longer, hands linked, the afternoon light spilling around them. Not love, perhaps not yet, but something equally powerful: choice. A deliberate decision to face the future side by side, come what may. When they stepped back outside, McCoy and Dawson were deep in conversation, their expressions serious. They broke off as Everett and Ayanna approached. "We've made our decision," Everett announced without preamble. "We want to make it official. Can you help with the arrangements, Judge?" McCoy nodded, satisfaction evident in his weathered face. "I can indeed. I brought the necessary documents with me just in case." He glanced at Dawson. "Sheriff, would you be willing to serve as a witness?" Dawson hesitated, his gaze flicking between Everett and Ayanna. You understand what you're doing, Thorn? He asked, his tone neutral, but his eyes sharp. This isn't something to enter into lightly, especially given the circumstances. I know exactly what I'm doing, Everett replied firmly. And why? Something like respect flickered across Dawson's face. Then I'll witness, he agreed. Though I can't promise Reynolds will take this lying down. We don't expect him to, Ayanna said, speaking for both of them. But we will be ready. The simple ceremony took place right there on the porch of Agua Fria, with the well visible in the background, a fitting symbol of what they were fighting to protect. McCoy read the necessary legal language. Everett and Ayanna spoke their vows with clear voices, and Dawson and the two clerks signed as witnesses. When it was done, McCoy presented them with the official document, the ink still drying in the hot desert air. This should be filed at the territorial office, he said. But given the circumstances, I've taken the liberty of having Mr. Davis and Mr. Wheeler certify it here. It's as legal as if you'd done it in a courthouse. Thank you, Judge, Everett said, accepting the paper. For everything. McCoy waved off his gratitude. Don't thank me yet. This is just the first step in what's likely to be a difficult fight. He glanced toward the horizon where the sun was beginning its downward arc. We should start back to town. Best not to be caught on the trail after dark, especially given Reynolds's recent activities. As they prepared to depart, Dawson drew Everett aside. Word of advice, Thorn, he said quietly. Don't let your guard down. Reynolds isn't the type to accept defeat, legal or otherwise. I'm counting on it, Everett replied grimly. Tell him, if you see him, that we're ready for whatever comes next. Dawson's expression remained carefully neutral. I'm not your messenger, Thorn. I enforce the law, that's all. And which side of the law will you be on when Reynolds makes his move? Everett pressed, studying the sheriff's face. Dawson met his gaze steadily. The right side, he said, though whether he meant the side of justice or the side of whoever proved strongest remained ambiguous. Just be careful. Reynolds has more friends than you do. With that cryptic warning, he mounted his horse and joined the others already starting down the trail toward Meridian Crossing. Everett and Ayanna watched them go, standing side by side on the porch of what was now legally, and in every other sense, their shared home. So, Everett said, as the riders disappeared into the distance. Mrs. Thorne. The name sounded strange even as he spoke it. For 13 years, the only Mrs. Thorne he had known was Elizabeth, now long in her grave on the hill east of the homestead. Ayanna seemed to sense his momentary discomfort. Among my people, she said gently, a woman does not always take her husband's name. She remains who she has always been, even as she joins her life to his. Everett nodded, grateful for her understanding. Ayanna it is then, he agreed, though in town for legal purposes. For those times I will be Mrs. Thorne, she conceded with a small smile. But here between us, I remain Ayanna, and you remain Everett, two who have chosen to stand together. The distinction felt right, honoring both their cultural traditions and the unique nature of their partnership. Not a conventional marriage built on romantic love, but something equally binding, a commitment born of shared purpose and mutual respect. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the land, they turned back to the house, their house now in a way it hadn't been before. The day's events had transformed Agua Fria from Everett's solitary refuge to their shared sanctuary. And though Reynolds's threat still loomed on the horizon, there was a new sense of purpose in facing it together. That night, as darkness settled over the homestead, Everett stood at the well drawing up water for the evening. The familiar rhythm of the task, lower the bucket, listen for the splash, haul it up hand over hand, had always brought him a measure of peace. Tonight, it seemed to carry new significance. He became aware of Ayana's presence before he saw her, a subtle shift in the air that spoke of her approach. She moved to stand beside him, looking down into the dark circle of the well. "In my mother's stories," she said softly, "water holds memory. It remembers all who have drawn from it, all who have offered thanks to its spirits." Everett considered this, watching as the surface of the water in the bucket gradually stilled, revealing their reflections side by side, his face weathered by sun, and years hers younger, but marked by its own trials, both of them outlined in silver by the rising moon. "Then it remembers Elizabeth," he said, speaking her name aloud for the first time in Ayana's presence. "And the child we lost. It remembers all the years I spent here alone." "Yes," Ayana agreed. "And now it will remember us together. A new memory alongside the old ones." The thought was oddly comforting, the idea that the well which had sustained him through his years of solitude would now witness this new chapter in his life, that it would hold the memory of this moment, of this choice, alongside all that had come before. "Reynolds will come," he said, changing the subject to the more immediate concern. "The marriage certificate won't stop him." "No," Ayana agreed, "but it changes the battle, and we are stronger now than we were before." Everett knew she was right. Whatever came next, whether legal maneuvering, direct confrontation, or some other strategy Reynolds might employ, they would face it not as isolated individuals, but as partners bound by choice and law. As they carried the water back to the house, the stars emerging overhead in their countless thousands, Everett felt something he had not experienced in years, a sense of possibility. Not just survival day to day, but the prospect of building something lasting, something worth fighting for. The feeling accompanied him into sleep, keeping the usual nightmares at bay, at least for one night. Morning would bring its own challenges, its own decisions. But for now, in the quiet darkness of Agua Fria, there was peace, fragile perhaps, and certainly temporary, but real nonetheless. A calm before whatever storm Reynolds would bring. And when that storm came, they would be ready. The sun was setting as Everett, Ayana, Thomas Miller, and the ranch hands accompanying them crested the final rise before Agua Fria. After their confrontation with Reynolds's men, the journey had been tense but uneventful, each rider scanning the horizon for signs of further trouble. Now, as the familiar silhouette of the homestead came into view, Everett felt a strange mixture of relief and wariness. "Something's different," he murmured to Ayana, who rode beside him. She nodded her keen eyes, noting what he had already seen: smoke rising from more than one chimney horses in the corral that weren't theirs, and the unmistakable signs of a small encampment surrounding the modest house. Thomas grinned at Everett's concerned expression. "Told you Pa brought some friends." As they drew closer, Everett was astonished to see the transformation of his once isolated homestead. At least a dozen men moved about the property with purpose, some carrying lumber to repair the barn roof, others reinforcing the corral. Near the house, a group of women tended a cooking fire, where a large pot bubbled with something that filled the air with savory aromas. And there, directing it all with the natural authority of a man accustomed to leadership, was Jacob Miller. He looked up at their approach, raising a hand in greeting. "About time you showed up, Thorne," he called. "We've been making ourselves at home." Everett dismounted, stunned by the activity around him. "Jacob, I don't know what to say." Miller clasped his shoulder firmly. "Don't need to say anything. Word travels fast, and when railroad men start throwing their weight around. Frank Cartwright sent a rider ahead to let us know you were on your way. The Hendersons are here too, and the Washburns arrived just before sundown." Everett looked around, recognizing faces he hadn't seen in years. Ranchers, farmers, and townsfolk who had known him during his martial days. People he had helped, defended, or simply treated fairly in a territory where justice often came second to power and money. "I never expected," he began. "Course you didn't," Miller interrupted with a knowing smile. "You've been hiding away so long you forgot how things work out here. We take care of our own, always have." Ayanna had dismounted as well, standing quietly beside Everett as she took in the transformed homestead. Several of the women by the cook fire glanced her way with undisguised curiosity, but their expressions held no hostility, only the natural interest in a newcomer. Sarah Miller approached, wiping her hands on her apron. "Mrs. Thorne," she greeted warmly, "I hope you don't mind us taking over your kitchen. Seemed the least we could do after you two rode all that way." "The help is welcome," Ayanna replied, her usual reserve softened by genuine gratitude. "Thank you." "Come on," Miller said, guiding them toward the house. "You both look dead on your feet. Rest a bit, have some food, and then we can talk about what comes next." Inside, Everett hardly recognized his own home. The furniture had been rearranged to accommodate more people. Fresh curtains hung at the windows, and the floor had been scrubbed clean. The straw-stuffed mattress on his bunk had been replaced with a proper one, and a colorful quilt, clearly brought by one of the women, was folded neatly at its foot. "Sarah wouldn't hear of leaving things as they were," Miller explained, noting Everett's surprise. "Said no decent home should be without proper comforts, especially with a new bride." Everett felt a flush of embarrassment at how sparse his living conditions must have seemed to the others. He had grown so accustomed to the bare necessities that he had forgotten what a real home might offer. "It's very kind," he managed. "Kindness has nothing to do with it," Sarah said briskly, entering with a steaming pot of coffee. "It's what neighbors do. Now sit, both of you. You look like you've been ridden hard and put away wet." They did as instructed, accepting mugs of coffee that tasted better than anything Everett had brewed in years. As the warmth spread through him, he felt the tension of the journey begin to ease. Beside him, Ayanna's shoulders relaxed slightly, though her eyes remained alert, taking in every detail of their transformed surroundings. "Reynolds's men tried to stop them on the trail," Thomas was explaining to his father, recounting their encounter. "3 of them looking for trouble. Lucky we showed up when we did." Miller's expression darkened. "That man's pushing his luck. Threatening folk on open trails, now he's getting desperate." "He knows we're gathering support," Everett said. "Trying to intimidate us into backing down before the hearing." "Won't work," Miller declared firmly. "We've got 17 men here now, more coming tomorrow. By the time the hearing rolls around, half the territory will be standing with you." A tall, lean man with a shock of white hair entered the room. Frank Cartwright, who must have ridden ahead with his sons, while Everett and Ayanna were still at his ranch. "Thorne," he acknowledged with a nod. "Good to see you made it back in one piece. My boys are setting up watch rotations for the night. Reynolds isn't likely to try anything with this many guns around, but no sense taking chances." Everett nodded his thanks, still somewhat overwhelmed by the sudden transformation of his solitary existence into this bustling community. For years he had convinced himself that isolation was preferable to the complications of human connections. Now, surrounded by people who had come to his aid without hesitation, he was beginning to reconsider that conviction. After a hearty meal served under the stars, the house being too small to accommodate everyone comfortably, Everett and Ayanna finally retreated to the privacy of their home. The main room had been vacated to give them space, though sounds of quiet conversation and occasional laughter drifted in from the camp outside. Ayanna moved to the window, looking out at the people gathered around campfires in what had been their empty yard just days before. "They came for you," she said softly, "because they remember the man you were." "They came for us," Everett corrected gently. "This isn't just about me anymore." She turned to face him, her expression thoughtful in the lamplight. "No," she agreed. "It is about something larger, the land, the water, the right to build, something without having it taken away." Everett nodded, understanding what she meant. Their personal struggle had become symbolic of a larger conflict, independent homesteaders against the railroads and moneymen who viewed the territory as something to be carved up for profit. "We should rest," he said, suddenly aware of how exhausted they both were after the long journey. "Tomorrow will be a full day." Ayanna moved toward the bunk with its new mattress and colorful quilt, then hesitated, glancing back at him. Since their marriage, they had maintained their separate sleeping arrangements at Agua Fria Everett on his bedroll near the door, Ayanna on the bunk. But during their journey, something had shifted between them. The nights spent side by side in the guest rooms of the Miller and Cartwright homes had created a new ease, a comfort in each other's presence that had not existed before. "There is room," she said, simply echoing words she had spoken at the Millers' home. Everett hesitated only briefly before nodding. They had faced danger together, ridden miles side by side, and now stood united against whatever Reynolds might bring. The artificial distance they had maintained at home seemed unnecessary, now even foolish. Later, as they lay together in the darkness, the sounds of the camp gradually quieting outside, Everett found himself thinking of how much had changed in the weeks since Ayanna's arrival. The solitude he had once clung to now seemed hollow compared to the partnership they had built, a partnership that had drawn others to their cause, transforming isolation into community. Beside him, Ayanna's breathing had slowed with approaching sleep. He glanced at her profile, barely visible in the faint moonlight filtering through the window. As she shifted slightly, her dress slipped from her shoulder, revealing the network of scars he had glimpsed once before when they were mending the fence. But there was something else there. Something he hadn't noticed in that brief glimpse, a raised mark on her upper arm, different from the other scars. Moving carefully to avoid waking her, Everett leaned closer, straining to see in the dim light. What he saw made his blood run cold. Burned into her skin was the clear shape of a horseshoe, a brand the kind used to mark livestock. But this particular design, with its distinctive notch at the curve, was not just any brand. Everett had seen it before years ago on the cattle and horses owned by traders who supplied the military outposts along the border. Traders like Nathan Reynolds. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Ayanna had not just heard stories of Reynolds's brother taking Apache women and girls. She had been one of them, marked like property before somehow escaping. This was what she had meant when she said there was more to her story than she had told him, when she had spoken of having her own reasons to stand against Reynolds that went beyond land and water. Everett felt a surge of rage, unlike anything he had experienced in years. To think of Ayanna, strong, dignified Ayanna, treated as property, branded like an animal. The thought was unbearable. And yet she had survived, had built herself into the remarkable woman who now lay beside him, who had chosen to seek him out despite everything she had endured. He must have made some sound, for she stirred, opening her eyes to find him watching her with an expression that even in the darkness she could read. "You saw," she said, simply, not a question. Everett nodded, unable to find words adequate to the moment. Ayanna sat up slowly, drawing the quilt around her shoulders, but leaving the brand exposed. "It happened after Cedar Creek," she said quietly. "The old woman who took me north died of fever a year later. I was alone, 10 years old, caught between worlds. Nathan Reynolds and his men found me trying to steal food from their camp." Her voice remained steady, though Everett could sense the effort it cost her. He kept women in cages, as you saw, but children were more valuable, easier to train, he said. He marked those he intended to keep. Everett's hands had clenched into fists. How did you escape? A raid, she replied. Another band of Apache warriors attacked the camp one night. In the confusion, I managed to slip away. I was lucky, most were not. She touched the brand lightly, tracing its outline with her fingertips. I have carried this mark for 17 years. A reminder of what men like Reynolds believe I am worth. Ayanna. Everett began, his voice rough with emotion. No, she interrupted gently. Do not pity me. I tell you this not to seek sympathy, but so you understand why I will not run from his brother. Why I chose to find you to stand with you. Some debts can only be paid in full. Everett reached out slowly, his calloused fingers brushing the brand with infinite gentleness. This changes nothing, he said, except to make me more certain that we're doing what's right. She covered his hand with her own. I know, she said simply. They sat that way for a long moment, connected by touch and by the shared understanding that their fight against Reynolds had acquired a new dimension, not just defense of home and water rights, but a reckoning for old crimes that had gone unpunished for too long. The next days passed in a blur of activity. More supporters arrived, ranchers from the far reaches of the territory, smallholders whose lands adjoined railroad grants, even a few townspeople from Meridian Crossing who had grown tired of Reynolds's increasing influence. The camp around Agua Fria grew, and with it a sense of common purpose that transcended individual interests. Matthew Cartwright, with his legal training, took charge of preparing their case for the hearing. He spent hours with Everett and Ayanna, reviewing documents, rehearsing testimony, and developing strategies to counter whatever Reynolds might present. The key, he explained one evening, as they sat around the table in the house papers spread before them, is to establish not just your legal right to the property, which is solid, but also your beneficial use of the resource. The territorial courts put significant weight on whether land and water are being actively used for productive purposes. The garden, the livestock, the homestead itself, all evidence of beneficial use, Frank Cartwright added, and with your marriage, you've strengthened your claim considerably. A family homestead carries more weight than a single man's holding. Reynolds knows that, Everett pointed out. He's already made it clear he doesn't consider our marriage legitimate, at least not in the eyes of a judge like McCullum. Matthew leaned forward, his expression intense. That's where we need to focus then, presenting your marriage as genuine established part of a pattern of putting down roots and developing the land. He glanced at Ayanna. No offense intended, ma'am, but there will be those who question the timing and nature of your union. I take no offense at truth, Ayanna replied calmly. Our marriage began as a practical arrangement, yes, but it has become more. She looked at Everett, something warm and certain in her gaze. We are partners in truth, not just in law. The simple declaration made without embarrassment or hesitation touched Everett deeply. It was true, he realized. Whatever had brought them together initially, her need for sanctuary, his need for help defending what was his, had evolved into a genuine partnership founded on mutual respect and growing affection. Then that's what we present to the court, Matthew said decisively. Not just legal documents, but the reality of what you've built together at Agua Fria. The morning of the hearing dawned clear and hot, the sky a hard blue that promised another scorching day. Everett stood on the porch watching as people prepared to ride into Meridian Crossing. The camp had thinned somewhat overnight, with some supporters having already gone ahead to secure positions in the small courthouse. Ayanna emerged from the house dressed in a new outfit she had sewn from the indigo fabric purchased in town. The simple dress was practical, but dignified, suited to the serious occasion. Around her neck hung a small beaded necklace, a gift from Sarah Miller, who had insisted she should have something pretty for such an important day. "Are you ready?" Everett asked, his own appearance more formal than usual. He had shaved carefully, trimmed his hair, and donned the one good shirt he owned, efforts that felt both strange and necessary. "Yes," Ayanna replied with characteristic directness. "Whatever happens today, we face it together." The ride to Meridian Crossing took on the air of a procession with Everett and Ayanna at its center, surrounded by allies who had once been strangers. As they approached the town, Everett could see that news of the hearing had spread far beyond their immediate circle. The main street was crowded with people, some clearly there to support their cause, others merely curious about the confrontation between the railroad interests and the independent landholders. The courthouse, a two-story wooden structure that also housed the jail and sheriff's office, was already surrounded by a restless crowd. Sheriff Dawson and his deputies stood on the steps maintaining order as people filed inside. Dawson nodded to Everett as they approached. "Quite a turnout," he observed neutrally, though his eyes betrayed surprise at the size of their entourage. "Word travels," Everett replied simply. Inside the courtroom was packed to capacity, with people standing along the walls when the benches filled. At the front, a raised desk awaited Judge McCullum, who had not yet appeared. To one side sat Victor Reynolds, with several well-dressed men who had the unmistakable look of company lawyers. Reynolds himself was impeccably attired, his expression one of confident superiority despite the clear numerical advantage of Everett's supporters in the room. Judge Harlan McCoy made his way through the crowd to where Everett, Ayanna, and Matthew Cartwright were preparing to take their places at the petitioner's table. "McCullum's in his chambers now," McCoy said in a low voice. "Thought you should know he and Reynolds had breakfast together at the hotel this morning." Everett felt his stomach tighten at this confirmation of Reynolds's influence. "Does that mean we've already lost?" McCoy shook his head slightly. "Not necessarily. McCullum is ambitious, yes, but he's also concerned with appearances. With this many witnesses, he'll be careful about how he conducts himself." The old judge glanced around at the crowded room. "I didn't expect this kind of turnout. You've got half the territory standing with you, Thorne." Before Everett could respond, a door at the front of the room opened, and Judge Abner McCullum entered. He was a tall, thin man with a carefully trimmed beard, and the stiff posture of someone who took his own importance very seriously. As he settled into his chair and arranged his papers, his gaze swept the packed room, a momentary flicker of surprise crossing his face before he composed himself. "This court is now in session," he announced, his voice carrying the cultivated accent of Eastern education. "We are here to consider the petition of the Arizona and Pacific Railroad Development Company regarding disputed water rights on the property known as Agua Fria, currently occupied by Everett Thorne." He glanced down at his papers. "Mr. Reynolds, as representative of the petitioner, you may present your case." Reynolds rose smoothly, buttoning his expensive jacket as he approached the bench. "Thank you, Your Honor. The Arizona and Pacific Railroad seeks clarification and enforcement of water rights that, according to our research, were improperly assigned in the original survey of the Thorne property." He produced a leather folder from which he extracted several documents. "I have here copies of the original territorial survey, along with subsequent amendments that indicate the well on Mr. Thorne's property actually draws from a water source that extends beyond his legal boundaries." As Reynolds continued his presentation, Everett leaned closer to Matthew, who was scrutinizing the documents being handed to the judge. "Can you see what he's showing, McCullum?" he whispered. Matthew shook his head slightly. Not clearly. But I've got copies of the original survey that Judge McCoy provided. We'll know soon enough if what he's presenting has been altered. For nearly an hour, Reynolds laid out his case with the smooth confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way. He cited legal precedents, referenced territorial statutes, and presented maps and surveys that appeared to support his claim. Throughout, Judge McCullum listened attentively, occasionally asking questions that to Everett's ear seemed designed to help Reynolds rather than challenge him. Finally, Reynolds concluded, "In light of these facts, Your Honor, we ask the court to recognize the Arizona and Pacific Railroad's rightful claim to the water rights in question, and to instruct Mr. Thorne to cease his obstruction of legitimate development in the territory." McCullum nodded thoughtfully. "Thank you, Mr. Reynolds. Mr. Thorne, you may now present your response to these claims." Everett rose, acutely aware of the contrast between his plain appearance and Reynolds's polished presentation. But as he moved forward, he felt Ayana's steady presence beside him, and behind them the silent support of dozens of people who had come to stand with them. "Your Honor," he began, his voice stronger than he had expected, "I've owned Agua Fria for 8 years. The well was there when I bought the property, and the water rights were clearly included in the deed." He produced his own documents, which Matthew had organized neatly. "I have here the original bill of sale signed and notarized, along with confirmation from the Territorial Land Office that the well and all water rights associated with it are legally mine." As Everett spoke, he felt himself growing more confident. The facts were on his side, whatever Reynolds might claim. And with Matthew Cartwright's legal knowledge guiding his presentation, he was able to counter each of Reynolds's arguments with clear, straightforward evidence. When he had finished presenting the documentary evidence, Everett took a breath, then continued in a more personal vein. "Your Honor, Agua Fria isn't just a piece of land with a well on it. It's a home, and now my wife's." He gestured to Ayana, who had remained seated at the table. "We've worked that land together, made it productive. The garden feeds us, the livestock thrives, and the house has become a true homestead. Under territorial law, that beneficial use strengthens our claim to the property and its water." McCullum's expression remained neutral, but Everett thought he detected a flicker of consideration in the judge's eyes. "Mr. Reynolds claims that your marriage is a recent convenience arranged specifically to strengthen your legal position. Do you wish to address that assertion?" This was the moment Matthew had prepared them for. Everett turned slightly, extending his hand to Ayana, who rose to join him before the judge. "Your Honor," he said, "my wife came to Agua Fria seeking sanctuary and a place to belong. Yes, we married recently, and yes, that marriage strengthens our legal claim. But what began as a practical arrangement has become a true partnership." He looked at Ayana, drawing strength from her steady gaze. "We stand together not just because the law recognizes our union, but because we have chosen to face whatever comes as one." Ayana stepped forward, then her voice clear and composed, as she addressed the judge directly. "I am Apache, Your Honor. I know that many would question my right to stand here to claim a home on this land. But the law you uphold recognizes that right just as it recognizes our marriage." Her dignity in the face of scrutiny was palpable, commanding respect, even from those who might have come prepared to dismiss her. "Agua Fria is our home. The water that flows there sustains us just as it could sustain others who respect its value." A murmur of approval ran through the crowd at her words. McCullum, visibly impressed, despite himself, nodded thoughtfully. "Thank you, Mrs. Thorne." Reynolds had been watching this exchange with growing tension, his earlier confidence giving way to obvious frustration. As McCullum began to ask Matthew Cartwright some technical questions about the survey boundaries, Reynolds suddenly rose from his seat. "Your Honor, if I may," he interrupted, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "We're getting sidetracked by emotional appeals and irrelevant personal details. The facts of the case are clear. The water rights were improperly assigned, and the railroad's claim is legitimate. Everything else is just theater." McCullum frowned at the interruption. "Mr. Reynolds, you've had your opportunity to present your case. Now it's Mr. Thorne's turn to respond." "But he's not responding to the facts," Reynolds persisted, color rising in his face. "He's trying to distract from the legal reality with stories about his convenient marriage to a—" "That's enough, Mr. Reynolds," McCullum cut in sharply, his concern for appearances clearly trumping whatever private arrangement they might have had. "This court will hear Mr. Thorne's full presentation without interruption." Reynolds subsided, but the momentary loss of composure had not gone unnoticed by anyone in the room. Everett exchanged a glance with Matthew, who gave a slight nod of encouragement. Reynolds's outburst had revealed the personal animus behind his legal claims, exactly what they had hoped to demonstrate. As the hearing continued, Matthew systematically dismantled Reynolds's evidence, pointing out discrepancies in the documents he had presented and demonstrating how they conflicted with the official records from the Territorial Land Office. The young lawyer's thoroughness was impressive, his Eastern education evident in the precision of his arguments. By the time they reached the midday recess, the mood in the courtroom had shifted perceptibly. What had begun as a seemingly one-sided case in favor of powerful railroad interests had become a genuine contest with the weight of community support clearly on the side of the homesteaders. Outside, in the relative coolness of the courthouse corridor, Judge McCoy approached Everett and Ayanna with a satisfied expression. "You're doing well," he said quietly. "McCullum's paying attention, and Reynolds is showing his true colors." "Do you think we have a chance?" Everett asked, still wary of hoping too much. McCoy nodded. "Better than a chance. But Reynolds won't give up easily. Be prepared for him to try something else when the hearing resumes." The old judge's warning proved prescient. When court reconvened after the recess, Reynolds had regained his composure and adopted a new strategy. "Your Honor," he began smoothly, "in light of the complexity of this case and the passionate interests involved, I would like to request a postponement of further proceedings. The Arizona and Pacific Railroad has recently come into possession of additional evidence that may clarify the boundaries in question, but we require time to properly prepare this material for the court's consideration." Everett tensed, recognizing the tactic for what it was, an attempt to delay the hearing until Reynolds could regroup, perhaps manufacture new evidence, or bring more pressure to bear on McCullum. To his relief, the judge seemed equally suspicious of the sudden request. "Mr. Reynolds, this court has already assembled to hear this matter. The witnesses are present, the evidence has been substantially presented. What is the nature of this additional material that you believe justifies a postponement?" Reynolds hesitated, clearly unprepared for direct questioning about his fictional evidence. "Surveys, Your Honor. More detailed surveys of the watershed that feeds the well in question. They require expert interpretation." McCullum's expression grew skeptical. "And these surveys were not available to you when you initiated this hearing?" "They were recently discovered," Reynolds replied, his usual smoothness faltering under the judge's scrutiny. Matthew Cartwright rose. "Your Honor, if I may, the petitioner has had ample time to prepare his case. The respondents have traveled considerable distances to be present today at significant hardship. We respectfully request that the hearing continue as scheduled." McCullum considered for a moment, then nodded decisively. Request for postponement denied. We will proceed with the hearing as planned. He fixed Reynolds with a stern look. The court expects all parties to present their best case with the evidence currently available. Reynolds returned to his seat, his expression dark with suppressed fury. As the afternoon wore on, it became increasingly clear that the tide had turned against him. Witness after witness from among Everett's supporters testified to the legitimacy of his claim, the productive use he had made of the property, and the community's opposition to the railroad's encroachment on independent homesteads. When Sheriff Dawson took the stand to confirm that he had witnessed Everett and Ayanna's marriage ceremony performed by Judge McCoy himself, Reynolds's lawyers could find no grounds to challenge his testimony. As the sun began to slant through the courthouse windows, McCullum called the proceedings to a close. "I have heard sufficient evidence to render a decision," he announced. "This court finds that the water rights to the well on the property known as Agua Fria are legally and rightfully held by Everett and Ayanna Thorne as part of their homestead claim. The petition of the Arizona and Pacific Railroad is denied." A cheer went up from the assembled crowd, quickly silenced by McCullum's gavel. "This court is adjourned," he declared, rising to return to his chambers without a glance at the fuming Reynolds. As people began to file out of the courtroom offering congratulations and backslaps to Everett and Ayanna, Reynolds pushed his way through the crowd to confront them. "Don't think this is over, Thorne," he said, his voice low and venomous. "A judge's ruling doesn't change what's mine by right." "It's over, Reynolds," Everett replied evenly. "You tried the legal route and failed. Go back to your railroad, leave us in peace, and we can all move on." Reynolds's face contorted with hatred. "Peace after what you did to my brother, never." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper meant only for Everett and Ayanna. "I'll have what's mine, one way or another." With that, he turned on his heel and stalked out, his lawyers hurrying after him. Jacob Miller, who had witnessed the exchange, moved to Everett's side. "Man's a sore loser," he observed. "Think he'll try something?" "Count on it," Everett replied grimly. "Let's get back to Agua Fria. I don't want to be on the road after dark." The journey back to the homestead was jubilant, despite Everett's lingering concerns about Reynolds's threats. The victory in court had energized their supporters, and plans were already being made for a celebration at Agua Fria that evening. They arrived as the sun was setting, painting the desert in gold and crimson. The sight of the homestead, their home, sent a surge of fierce protectiveness through Everett. They had won the legal battle, but Reynolds's parting words suggested the war was not yet over. As people dismounted and began preparing for the evening's festivities, Everett pulled Jacob Miller and Frank Cartwright aside. "Postcards tonight," he said quietly. "Reynolds isn't the type to accept defeat gracefully." Both men nodded, understanding the gravity of his concern. "We'll set watches," Miller agreed. "No one gets near the place without us knowing." Despite the precautions, the evening unfolded in a spirit of celebration. Food and drink were shared around campfires, stories exchanged, and even music played when someone produced a fiddle. It was the kind of gathering Everett had avoided for years, preferring his solitude to the complexities of human connection. Now, watching Ayanna move among their guests with quiet dignity, accepting congratulations and thanks with grace, he found himself reconsidering the value of community. As the night deepened and the celebrations began to wind down, Everett and Ayanna finally retreated to the privacy of their home. The house was quiet after the bustle of the day, the lamplight casting a warm glow over the simple furnishings that now felt truly theirs in a way they hadn't before. "We won," Ayanna said, removing the beaded necklace and setting it carefully on the table. "The hearing, yes," Everett agreed, checking his revolver before setting it within easy reach, a habit he wasn't ready to abandon despite their legal victory. "But Reynolds won't stop here. You heard him. I did. She moved to the window, looking out at the fires still burning in the yard. He has carried his hatred for 20 years. Such a burden does not set down easily. Everett joined her at the window, standing close enough that their shoulders touched. No, he agreed. But neither does our resolve. Ayanna turned to face him, her expression softened by the lamplight. Do you regret it? She asked quietly. Opening your door that day, taking on this fight. The question caught Everett off guard, though he realized it had been implicit in many of their conversations since her arrival. Did he regret the end of his solitude, the complications she had brought into his carefully ordered existence? No, he said, the simplicity of his answer surprising even him. I regret many things in my life, Ayanna, but not that, never that. She held his gaze, searching for something in his expression. Whatever she found there must have satisfied her, for she nodded once, a small smile touching her lips. Nor do I, she said. Whatever comes next. They were still standing that way close, but not quite touching, when a shout from outside shattered the moment. Riders coming, armed men approaching from the east. Everett moved instantly, grabbing his revolver and heading for the door. Ayanna was right behind him, her own movements quick and decisive. Outside, the camp had erupted into activity. Men were taking up defensive positions, women and younger folk retreating to the relative safety of the barn and outbuildings. Jacob Miller strode toward them, rifle in hand. At least a dozen riders, he reported grimly. Moving fast, torches lit. Can only be Reynolds's men. Everett scanned the darkness beyond the yard, where the approaching riders were now visible, a line of mounted men silhouetted against the night sky by the flaming torches they carried. The sight sent a chill through him. Reynolds had wasted no time in making his move clearly, hoping to catch them off guard during the post-hearing celebrations. Get everyone inside who's not fighting, he ordered. And protect the well. That's what they'll aim for first. As preparations for defense continued around him, Everett felt a calm determination replace his initial alarm. They had faced Reynolds in court, and won. Now they would face his hired guns, and with the support gathered around them, they would prevail there too. Ayanna appeared at his side, a rifle in her hands, one of the spares brought by the ranch hands. I can shoot, she said simply when he glanced at her in surprise. I never doubted it, he replied, moving toward the low stone wall that surrounded the yard. It wasn't much as fortifications went, but it offered some cover. Stay low, aim careful. The riders were closing fast now, their torches cutting bright arcs through the darkness as they approached. Everett recognized the lead rider as the same man who had confronted them on the trail, Reynolds's hired gun, now leading what appeared to be a small army of mercenaries. Thorne, the man shouted as they drew near enough to be heard. Reynolds says to tell you, this is your last chance. Clear out now, all of you, or we burn the place to the ground. Not going to happen? Everett called back, his voice steady. The court ruled, the land is ours. Turn around and ride away while you still can. The leader laughed, an ugly sound that carried clearly across the yard. Court rulings don't mean much out here, Marshal. You know that better than most. With that, he spurred his horse forward, the others following in a rush of hoofbeats and war cries. As they thundered into the yard, several of the riders hurled their torches toward the barn and house, while others fired wildly into the air, creating chaos and confusion. The defense Everett and his allies had hastily organized responded with disciplined fire. Several of the attackers fell from their saddles at the first volley, clearly unprepared for the level of resistance they encountered. The others scattered, seeking cover where they could find it. In the flickering light of the fallen torches, which had mostly landed harmlessly on bare earth, Everett caught glimpses of the battle unfolding around him. Miller and his ranch hands were holding the northern approach, while the Cartwrights defended the area near the barn. Sheriff Dawson, who must have ridden out from town after them, was directing several deputies in a methodical sweep from east to west, pushing Reynolds's men back toward the arroyos beyond the homestead. And beside him, Ayanna was proving herself every bit the fighter. He had suspected she might be steady-focused, wasting no shots as she helped defend their home. The battle seemed to be turning in their favor when a shout went up from the direction of the well. "They're at the water! 3 men trying to set charges!" Everett's blood ran cold. Dynamite would destroy not just the well structure, but possibly the underground spring that fed it. Without the well, Agua Fria would be worthless, exactly what Reynolds wanted. "Cover me!" he shouted to Ayanna, then sprinted toward the well, keeping low as bullets kicked up dust around him. He reached the well just as one of Reynolds's men was placing a bundle of dynamite against the stone structure. Without hesitation, Everett tackled him, driving him away from the well. They rolled in the dust, grappling for control. The man was younger, stronger, but Everett fought with the desperate determination of someone defending everything that mattered to him. A shot cracked through the night, and the man went suddenly limp. Everett looked up to see Ayanna standing a few yards away, her rifle still aimed at the spot where the man had been. 2 other bodies lay nearby, the rest of the demolition team already dealt with. "The charges!" Everett gasped, scrambling to his feet. "We need to—" Before he could finish, a tremendous explosion rocked the night, sending a shower of stone and dirt high into the air. But it wasn't the well that had exploded. It was the ground several yards away where one of the fallen men must have dropped the dynamite. The force of the blast tore open the earth, revealing a dark cavity beneath. And from that cavity, water began to gush, not a trickle, but a powerful flow that quickly formed a stream running downhill toward the arroyos. Everett stared in amazement as the water continued to pour forth, far more than could be explained by a damaged pipe or small underground pool. This was something else entirely, a significant underground river suddenly exposed to the surface. "The stories," Ayanna breathed, coming to stand beside him. "The great river beneath the earth." It was true. The fighting had paused, both defenders and attackers momentarily transfixed by the spectacle of water erupting from the dry ground. Then, gradually, Reynolds's remaining men began to retreat clearly, recognizing that their mission had failed in the most unexpected way possible. As the sounds of combat faded, replaced by the astonishing rush of water, Everett turned to Ayanna. "Your people's legends," he said wonderingly. "They were right all along." She nodded, her expression one of awe mixed with vindication. "The water spirits have chosen to reveal themselves," she said. "Perhaps they grew tired of men fighting over what was always meant to be shared." The irony was not lost on Everett. Reynolds had sent his men to destroy the well, to render Agua Fria worthless. Instead, they had inadvertently revealed a water source far more valuable than the original well-enough water to sustain not just their homestead, but potentially many others in the region. By dawn, the last of Reynolds's men had fled, leaving behind their dead and wounded. The newly exposed spring continued to flow strongly, forming a small pond before finding its way to the natural drainage channels that led toward the valley. Around it, the people who had fought to defend Agua Fria now gathered in amazement, watching as the desert literally bloomed before their eyes, dormant seeds awakening in the suddenly moist soil. Sheriff Dawson, his hat pushed back on his head as he surveyed the scene, shook his head in disbelief. "Never seen anything like it," he admitted. "You realize what this means, Thorne? This water could transform the whole region. Everett nodded, the implications already clear in his mind. "It's not just about our homestead anymore," he said. "This is bigger than that." "Much bigger," agreed Judge McCoy, who had ridden out from town with Dawson the night before. "The territorial authorities will want to have a say in how this resource is managed, and Reynolds will be back with new claims, you can be sure of that." "Let him come," Miller said firmly, joining their conversation. "We beat him in court, we beat him in battle, and now we've got something worth far more than his railroad could ever offer: water that can sustain independent ranchers and farmers throughout the territory." As the others continued to discuss the implications of the discovery, Everett sought out Ayanna, who had moved to stand at the edge of the newly formed pond. The morning light caught in her dark hair, illuminating the quiet strength in her profile as she gazed at the water. "What are you thinking?" he asked, coming to stand beside her. She turned to him, her expression serene despite the night's violence and the dramatic changes it had brought. "I am thinking of circles," she said. "How they close and open again. 20 years ago, you saved me from death. Now, together, we have found life in the midst of another kind of death." She gestured to the flowing water. "The old ones said water remembers. Perhaps it remembered you and your kindness, and chose to reveal itself when we needed it most." Everett wasn't sure he believed in water spirits or the memory of the earth, but standing there with Ayanna watching as the desert transformed around them, he couldn't entirely dismiss the idea either. There was a symmetry to it all that transcended mere coincidence. "What happens now?" he asked, as much to himself as to her. Ayanna's hand found his, her fingers warm and certain as they clasped his own. "Now we build," she said simply. "Not just a house or a farm, but a future. One that honors the gift we have been given." Everett looked around at the homestead, at the people who had come to their aid, at the water flowing where none had been before, at the woman who had appeared on his doorstep and changed everything. For so long he had been focused on survival, on mere existence. Now, for the first time in years, he found himself thinking of growth, of possibility, of a life that extended beyond the narrow boundaries he had set for himself. "Together," he said, turning back to Ayanna. She smiled, then the rare, radiant expression that transformed her serious face and revealed the spirit beneath. "Together," she agreed, and as the sun climbed higher in the sky, painting the newly flowing water with gold, Everett Thorne felt the final walls around his heart give way. The man who had once chosen solitude above all else now stood at the center of a community, his hand linked with a woman who had crossed deserts to find him, surrounded by possibility, where once there had been only dust. The well, the original well that had been the focus of so much conflict, still stood unharmed in the midst of it all. But now it was no longer the sole source of life at Agua Fria. It had been joined by something larger, deeper, more abundant. Like the hearts of the two people who had fought to protect it, the water had found a new way to flow.